cold iron closed around Elena's wrists before she even understood what was happening. One moment, she was standing in the courtyard, trying to explain herself, and the next, 2 guards were dragging her toward the gate while the whole pack watched in silence. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I did not take anything from the storehouse. I would never do that." Nobody answered her. Nobody even looked at her with kindness. The guards, both twice her size, gripped her arms so tightly that she knew there would be marks tomorrow, if she lived long enough to see tomorrow. Alpha Dorian stood at the top of the stone steps, his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. Beside him stood Garrick, the beta, and behind Garrick, half hidden in his shadow, stood his daughter Vesper. Elena caught the smallest flicker of satisfaction on Vesper's face before it disappeared behind a mask of false concern. "Elena of the Ashfall Pack," Dorian said, his voice carrying across the courtyard like thunder rolling over hills. "You have been found guilty of theft from the pack's winter stores. Food meant for pups and elders, taken in the night by your hand." "I never touched the stores," Elena said. "Someone is lying. Please, just let me explain." "Silence," Dorian snapped. The word hit her harder than a blow. She closed her mouth, but her eyes searched the crowd, desperate for one face that might defend her. There was no one. Her parents had died 3 winters ago, taken by a sickness that swept through half the pack. Since then, she had lived alone at the edge of the territory, doing whatever small work the pack allowed an Omega like her to do. She had no mate to stand beside her, no family to speak on her behalf, no rank high enough to be believed over a lie. The guards pulled her toward the great iron gate that marked the border of Ashfall territory, the gate that separated the safety of the pack from the wild, unclaimed lands beyond. Thick chains hung from a post beside it, rusted with age, but strong enough to hold a wolf twice Elena's size. "You will remain here through the night," Dorian announced to the gathered pack, as a lesson to anyone who thinks they can steal from their own kind and go unpunished. "Perhaps the cold will remind you of what loyalty means." Elena's stomach twisted. She had heard of this punishment before, whispered about in low voices, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. Chaining someone at the gate meant more than humiliation. It meant leaving them exposed to the night, to the weather, and worst of all, to whatever roamed beyond the border where the pack's protection ended. The guards forced her to her knees beside the post. One of them wrapped the heavy chain around her wrists, binding them together in front of her, then looped the rest of it around the iron post so she could not move more than a few steps in any direction. The metal was freezing against her skin, and she flinched as it settled into place with a heavy, final click. "Please," Elena whispered, looking up at Dorian one last time. "I have done nothing wrong." Dorian did not answer. He simply turned and walked back toward the pack house, his long coat sweeping behind him, and the crowd began to disperse, following their alpha, whispering among themselves. A few glanced back at her with something like pity, but none of them stepped forward. No one dared to challenge the alpha's judgment, not even for an innocent woman. Only Vesper lingered a moment longer than the rest. She walked past Elena slowly, close enough that Elena could smell the faint scent of vanilla and smoke that always clung to her clothes. Vesper did not say a word. She only smiled, small and secret, before turning and following her father inside. That smile told Elena everything she needed to know. Vesper had done this. Somehow, some way, she had arranged for the stolen food to be traced back to Elena's small cabin at the edge of the territory. Elena did not know why. She had never done anything to Vesper, had barely spoken more than a few words to her in years, but the beta's daughter had always looked at her with a strange, simmering dislike, as though Elena's mere existence was some kind of insult. Now Elena understood. Whatever the reason, Vesper wanted her gone, or at least broken, and chaining her to the gate overnight was a good beginning. The courtyard emptied slowly, until Elena was alone, kneeling in the dirt with her wrists bound, and the great iron gate looming above her. The sun had already begun to sink behind the tall pines that surrounded the territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Soon it would be dark, and the temperature would drop fast, the way it always did in the mountains once the sun disappeared. She tested the chain, pulling gently at first, then harder, but it held firm. The post had been driven deep into the ground, and the metal did not give even a little. She was truly stuck here, exposed, until someone decided to release her, if anyone decided to release her at all. Hours passed. The sky turned from purple to black, and stars began to appear, cold and distant and uncaring. Elena wrapped her arms around herself as best she could, trying to hold in whatever warmth remained in her thin cloak. But the wind was picking up, sweeping down from the mountains and cutting straight through the fabric. She thought about crying, but she was too tired, too numb with cold and disbelief, to manage even that. Instead, she simply sat, staring at the gate in front of her, at the darkness beyond it where the forest stretched out into land that belonged to no pack at all. She had heard stories about what lived out there. Rogue wolves who had been cast out of their own packs, wild creatures that answered to no laws. It was not a place anyone wanted to be after dark, let alone chained and helpless. A twig snapped somewhere in the trees beyond the gate. Elena's head snapped up, her heart suddenly pounding. She strained her eyes against the darkness, trying to see what had made the sound, but the forest gave nothing away. For a long moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than any noise, the kind that made the hair on her arms rise. Then she saw it. Two eyes, low to the ground, glowing faintly in the dark, watching her from between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not move, did not dare to make a sound, as the eyes shifted closer, and slowly, the shape of an enormous black wolf emerged from the shadows of the forest. It was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, larger even than Alpha Dorian in his shifted form, with fur so dark it seemed to swallow what little moonlight touched it. Its eyes were a piercing shade of silver, almost glowing, fixed directly on her. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run, but the chains held her in place, and even if they had not, she doubted her trembling legs could carry her anywhere. She forced herself to stay still, to breathe slowly, the way her mother had once taught her when facing something dangerous. Do not show fear. Fear invites attack. The wolf did not attack. It simply stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the gate, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It only watched, its massive head tilted slightly, as though it were trying to understand something about her that it could not quite grasp. Minutes passed. Elena's heartbeat slowly began to calm, though she remained wary, her eyes never leaving the creature. She had never encountered a wolf this size before, and something about the way it carried itself, the quiet control in its stillness, told her this was no ordinary rogue. "What do you want?" she whispered, more to herself than to the wolf, not really expecting an answer. The wolf's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but it did not move closer. It stayed exactly where it was, half hidden by the shadow of the trees, watching her the way a guard might watch something precious that had been left unprotected. Elena did not know how long they remained like that, the two of them separated by the iron gate, staring at each other in the darkness. It felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Eventually, without warning, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the forest, as silently as it had come, leaving Elena alone once more, with the cold, and the chains, and the distant sound of the wind moving through the pines. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her body sagging slightly against the post. Whatever that creature had been, it had not hurt her, it had not even tried, and yet something about its gaze lingered in her mind, a strange feeling she could not quite name, as though she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time, in a very long while. The night stretched on, long and bitter. Elena drifted in and out of a shallow, uncomfortable sleep, jolting awake each time the cold bit too deep, or a sound echoed from the trees. Her wrists ached from the chains, and her body shivered uncontrollably by the time the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern sky. When dawn finally broke, she heard footsteps approaching from within the pack's territory. She lifted her head, hoping against hope that someone had come to release her, but instead, she saw two of the pack's younger guards, sent to check that she remained secure, not to set her free. They looked at her with a mixture of discomfort and indifference, said nothing, and left again after confirming the chains still held. No food, no water, no word on how long this punishment would last. Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at every part of her, and tried to steady her racing thoughts. She thought of her parents, of the small cabin she called home, of the quiet life she had built for herself despite having no one left to share it with. She thought about Vesper's smile, cold and satisfied, and wondered what she had done to deserve such cruelty from someone she barely knew. And she thought about the wolf, the massive black creature with silver eyes, who had watched her through the night without ever crossing the gate. She did not know it yet, could not possibly have known it, but that wolf was no ordinary stranger passing through Ashfall territory. He was Kale, the Alpha King, ruler over every pack in the northern lands, a figure so powerful that most wolves never saw him in person, only heard stories of his strength and the iron fairness of his rule. He traveled without announcement, without guards, moving quietly through the territories under his protection, to see with his own eyes how his people were truly treated, away from the polished words and careful presentations offered to him during formal visits. He had come to Ashfall following whispers, rumors that had reached his court of a pack, where the Alpha ruled with favoritism, where those without rank or family were treated as less than the rest. He had not expected to find proof of it chained to the very gate meant to protect the territory, an innocent woman left to suffer for a crime that, even from a distance, he could sense did not sit right. Kale had smelled it the moment he arrived close enough. The layers of scent around Elena, confusion, injustice, false accusation, clinging to the air like smoke. Wolves could sense truth in ways humans could not. Subtle signals in scent and behavior that most overlooked, but that a king as experienced as Kale had learned to read like a book. He had almost stepped forward that first night, almost revealed himself, and demanded her immediate release. But something held him back, some instinct that told him to watch first, to understand the pack's dynamics before acting, to learn who among Ashfall's leadership was responsible for this cruelty, before he tore the truth out of them by force. So instead, he watched. And in watching, he saw something in Elena that struck him deeply, a quiet, unbroken strength beneath her fear, a dignity that no chain could take from her, even as she knelt shivering in the dirt. She had not begged. She had not wept and pleaded the way many might have. She had simply endured, her spine straight even in her exhaustion, her eyes steady even when they trembled with cold. He found himself thinking about her long after he had returned to the shadows of the forest, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest, one he could not immediately name. Kale was not a wolf given to sentiment. He had ruled for many years, had seen betrayal and ambition and cruelty in every form, and had built walls around himself that few had ever managed to breach. And yet this stranger, chained and helpless, had somehow slipped past those walls in the space of a single night. He told himself it was simply concern for injustice, the same concern that had brought him to Ashfall in the first place. But as the first light of dawn touched the horizon and he made his way back toward the small camp where he had left his personal effects hidden, he could not shake the image of her eyes meeting his in the darkness, steady and unafraid despite everything. He would return that night, he decided, not simply to observe, but to act. He needed to know more about who she was, why she had been targeted, and whether the cruelty he had witnessed was an isolated incident or a symptom of something far more rotten within Ashfall's leadership. What he did not yet know, what even his own instincts had not fully revealed to him, was that the moment he had looked into Elena's eyes across that gate, an ancient bond, older than either of them, had begun to stir, one written into the blood of his line, long before he was born, waiting only for the right soul to awaken it. Back at the gate, Elena remained kneeling in the dirt as the sun rose fully over Ashfall territory, painting the sky a pale, indifferent blue. She did not know that she had been watched by someone far more significant than a passing rogue. She only knew that she was cold, exhausted, and utterly alone, chained to a post at the edge of the only home she had ever known, waiting for a punishment to end that she had never deserved in the first place. But somewhere beyond the tree line, in the quiet shadows of the forest, something had shifted. A king who ruled over vast lands and countless lives had found, in the most unlikely of places, someone who mattered more than he yet understood. And though neither of them knew it in that cold morning light, their story had only just begun. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, but its light brought little warmth. Elena's knees had grown numb from kneeling on the hard ground, and her arms ached from holding the same position through the long night. She tried shifting her weight, testing whether she could find any position that eased the pain in her joints, but the chain gave her almost no room to move. Footsteps approached again, lighter this time, unhurried. Elena recognized the scent before she even lifted her head: vanilla and smoke. Vesper stopped a few feet away, close enough to be seen clearly, but far enough that she would not have to lower herself to Elena's level. She wore a fine green cloak, clearly dressed for a comfortable morning, and she studied Elena with an expression that might have passed for concern to anyone who did not know her better. "You look terrible," Vesper said, tilting her head. "I almost feel sorry for you." "Almost," Elena repeated quietly, refusing to look away. "But not quite." Vesper's mouth curved into a small smile. "You always were clever, Elena. Clever enough to know when to keep your mouth shut, usually. I wonder what happened this time." "I didn't take anything," Elena said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at every word. "You know I didn't. I think you know exactly who did." Something flickered behind Vesper's eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Careful," she said softly. "Accusations without proof are dangerous things to make, especially for someone in your position. My father could decide this punishment isn't harsh enough." "Why?" Elena asked, ignoring the threat. "What did I ever do to you?" Vesper's smile faded slightly, replaced by something colder. "You exist," she said simply. "That has always been enough." She turned before Elena could respond, her cloak sweeping behind her as she walked back toward the pack house, leaving the words hanging heavy in the cold morning air. Elena stared after her, confusion mixing with a slow, bitter understanding. Whatever Vesper's true reasons were, they went deeper than a simple accusation of theft. This was something older, something Elena could not fully grasp, buried in years of small slights and quiet resentments she had never understood. The day dragged on. No one else approached her. She watched pack members go about their business in the distance, some glancing her way with pity, most avoiding her gaze entirely, as though her suffering might somehow become contagious if they looked too long. By afternoon, thirst had become a sharper pain than the cold, her throat dry and raw, her lips beginning to crack. She thought again of the wolf from the previous night, the massive black shape with silver eyes that had watched her without ever crossing the gate. She found herself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that it would return. There had been something in its stillness that felt less like a threat and more like a strange, silent companionship, as though for those brief hours in the dark, she had not been entirely alone. As the sun began its slow descent once more, painting the sky in the same deep colors as the night before, Elena felt her strength beginning to falter. She had gone without food for a full day now, without water for nearly as long, and the chains had rubbed her wrists raw beneath the metal. She leaned her head against the cold iron post, closing her eyes, trying to summon whatever resilience remained within her. She did not know how much longer the pack intended to leave her here. She did not know if anyone would come at all, or if she was simply meant to endure this until her body gave out entirely. All she knew was that somewhere in the growing darkness, beyond the gate, something was watching, waiting, and for reasons she could not explain, she found herself less afraid of the forest than she was of the pack she had once called home. When the first stars began to appear overhead, faint and scattered across the deepening sky, Elena thought she heard the soft crunch of leaves once more, careful and deliberate, moving through the trees beyond the gate. Her exhausted body tensed, not with fear this time, but with something closer to anticipation. She lifted her head, searching the darkness, and waited to see if the eyes would return. The shape that emerged from the trees was not the wolf. A man stepped into the pale moonlight instead, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak that did little to hide the sheer size and presence of him. His hair was black, his features sharp and controlled, and his eyes, Elena realized with a jolt, were the same piercing silver she remembered from the night before. This was no ordinary traveler. This was the wolf, shifted into his human form, standing just beyond the gate, as though deciding whether to cross it. Elena's breath caught. She pressed herself instinctively back against the post, though the chains gave her nowhere to retreat. "You," she whispered. "You were the wolf." He did not answer immediately. His gaze moved over her, taking in the chains, the raw marks on her wrists, the exhaustion carved into her face, and something tightened visibly in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, carrying an authority that made her instincts stand at attention despite her exhaustion. "Who did this to you?" The bluntness of the question caught her off guard. "The pack," she said carefully. "My alpha. I was accused of theft." "Did you do it?" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, fueled by a full day of frustration and fear. "I have never stolen anything in my life. Someone wanted me punished, and they got what they wanted." The stranger studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the unsettling feeling that he was not simply listening to her words, but reading something beneath them. Some truth her scent or her posture revealed that her voice alone could not. Finally, he took a step closer to the gate, close enough that she could see the iron control in his expression, the way his hands remained loosely at his sides, even though tension radiated from every line of his body. "I am not permitted to cross into pack territory uninvited," he said. "But you should not be left like this." "Then why haven't you left?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "You watched me all last night and did nothing. Why come back now?" Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not fully form. "Because I could not stop thinking about you," he admitted, and then seemed almost surprised at his own honesty, as though the words had escaped before he intended to release them. Elena did not know how to respond to that. She studied him carefully, trying to understand what kind of wolf could shift so easily, could carry himself with such quiet, unshakable authority, and yet stood here in the darkness, speaking to a chained prisoner, as though her suffering genuinely troubled him. "Who are you?" she asked. He hesitated, just slightly, before answering. "My name is Kale. I am passing through these lands." It was not a lie, not exactly, but it was far from the whole truth, and something in his tone told Elena he was choosing his words with great care. She did not press further. She was too tired, too thirsty, too worn down by the long hours of cold and humiliation to summon the energy for more questions. Kale crouched near the gate, careful to keep his body on the correct side of the boundary line, and reached into a small pack slung across his shoulder. He withdrew a water skin and held it out through the bars. "Drink," he said simply. Elena hesitated only a moment before reaching for it with chained hands, her fingers trembling as she brought it to her lips. The water was cool and clean, and she drank greedily, barely pausing for breath, until Kale gently reminded her to slow down before she made herself sick. When she finally lowered the water skin, she felt marginally more human than she had in hours. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could express. "You should not have to thank anyone for basic kindness," Kale said, his voice edged with something that sounded almost like anger, though it was clearly not directed at her. "What kind of pack treats its own this way?" "A pack led by people who care more about power than fairness," Elena said before she could stop herself. She glanced toward the pack house in the distance, half expecting someone to appear and catch her speaking so openly against her own alpha, but the courtyard remained empty and silent. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't say such things to a stranger." "You should say them to someone," Kale replied. "Silence protects no one but the guilty." They remained like that for a while, Kale crouched at the gate, and Elena leaning against the post, talking quietly in the dark. She told him, hesitantly at first and then with growing openness, about her parents, about the sickness that had taken them, about the years she had spent alone at the edge of the territory, doing whatever work the pack allowed without complaint, never causing trouble, never asking for more than she was given. She told him about Vesper's visit that morning, about the strange, bitter satisfaction in the beta's daughter's eyes. Kale listened without interrupting, his expression darkening slightly with every detail, though he kept his reactions carefully controlled. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, considering everything she had shared. "This Vesper," he said eventually, "she has some reason to want you gone. Do you have any idea what it might be?" Elena shook her head. "None. I've barely spoken to her in years. I keep to myself. I don't cause problems." She paused, then added quietly, "I think that might be the problem. Some people can't stand seeing someone survive without needing them." Kale's silver eyes studied her with a new kind of intensity, something that felt less like simple curiosity and more like recognition, as though he were seeing something in her he had not expected to find. "You are stronger than you realize," he said quietly. Elena laughed, though the sound came out hollow and tired. "I'm chained to a post, unable to move, freezing, and half convinced I'll be left here until I collapse. I don't feel very strong." "Strength is not the absence of suffering," Kale said. "It is enduring it without losing who you are. You have not begged. You have not turned to cruelty, even after everything done to you. That is strength, whether you recognize it in yourself or not." Something about the sincerity in his voice made Elena's eyes sting unexpectedly. She looked away, blinking quickly, unwilling to let a stranger see her cry after she had managed to hold herself together through everything else. "I should go," Cale said eventually, glancing toward the horizon where the faintest hints of gray were beginning to creep into the eastern sky. "I do not wish to draw attention that could make things worse for you, but I will return." "Why?" Elena asked again, unable to help herself. "You don't know me. Whatever is happening here isn't your concern." Cale rose to his feet, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read, something complicated and restrained. "I think it might be more my concern than you realize," he said quietly. "Rest, if you can. I will not let this continue much longer." Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped back into the shadows of the trees, and within moments, the darkness swallowed him whole, leaving no trace that he had ever been there at all, except the empty water skin resting near the base of the gate. Elena stared at the spot where he had disappeared, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers to. Who was this man, this wolf, who moved with such quiet authority and spoke with such unexpected gentleness? Why did her instincts, worn thin as they were by exhaustion and fear, seem to relax in his presence rather than tense further, the way they had with every member of her own pack? She thought back over everything he had said, turning each word over in her mind, like a stone she was trying to understand from every angle. He had spoken of concern that felt personal, of returning, of not letting her suffering continue much longer. And yet he carried himself with a restraint that suggested he was holding something back, some larger truth he had not been ready to share. A simple traveler did not speak with that kind of quiet command. A simple traveler did not move through the forest as silently as smoke, or shift from wolf to man with such practiced ease that it seemed almost effortless. Elena had met very few outsiders in her life. Ashfall kept mostly to itself, trading occasionally with neighboring packs but rarely welcoming strangers within its borders. She had heard stories, of course, tales passed around the fire, about other packs, about the vast territories that stretched beyond the mountains, and about the Alpha King who supposedly ruled over all of it, from some distant court she had never seen, and never expected to see. But those stories had always felt distant, more myth than reality, the kind of thing spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by elders who claimed to have witnessed his power firsthand. She dismissed the thought as quickly as it formed. It was absurd to imagine that a figure so powerful, so far removed from the daily struggles of a pack like Ashfall, would trouble himself to visit her at a gate in the middle of the night, offering water and quiet words of comfort to a chained Omega no one else cared to notice. Whoever Cale was, surely he was simply a wanderer, a wolf without a pack of his own, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps by some flicker of decency that most others in her life seemed to lack. And yet the thought lingered, refusing to be fully dismissed, as she settled back against the cold iron post and allowed her exhausted body to finally succumb to sleep. She did not have long to consider it. Exhaustion pulled at her heavily now, the water in her stomach and the brief comfort of conversation loosening the tight grip of fear that had kept her alert through the worst of the night. Her eyes grew heavy, and despite the cold and the discomfort of her position, she finally drifted into a deeper sleep than she had managed since the chains first closed around her wrists. She did not see the second dawn break over Ashfall territory. She did not see the guards approach to check on her again, exchanging confused glances at the empty water skin near the gate, wondering how it had gotten there, and choosing, wisely, not to mention it to anyone. She only woke hours later, stiff and disoriented, to the sound of raised voices coming from somewhere near the pack house, voices that carried an unmistakable edge of alarm. Elena struggled to sit up straighter, her body protesting every movement after 2 nights bound to the same position. She strained to hear what was happening, catching fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Someone had arrived, someone important. The pack was in an uproar, guards rushing toward the courtyard, servants scrambling to prepare for something Elena could not yet understand. Whatever was happening, it felt significant, the kind of disruption that did not occur in the quiet, controlled routine of Ashfall's daily life. Elena watched from her place at the gate, chained and helpless, as the courtyard filled with anxious, hurrying figures, and wondered with a growing, uneasy curiosity what could possibly have thrown her entire pack into such visible disorder. She did not have to wonder for long. Within minutes, Alpha Dorian himself appeared at the top of the stone steps, his face pale beneath its usual stern composure, flanked by Garrick and several senior guards, all of them staring toward the gate, toward Elena, with expressions she had never seen on their faces before. Fear. Alpha Dorian descended the stone steps quickly, his usual measured pace replaced by something closer to urgency. Garrick followed close behind, his face equally pale, while the guards trailed after them, glancing nervously toward the tree line as though expecting danger to emerge at any moment. Elena watched, confused and wary, as the group approached the gate. She had never seen her Alpha move with anything less than deliberate authority, and the sight of him hurrying, his composure visibly cracking, sent a fresh wave of unease through her exhausted body. "What's happening?" she asked, unable to help herself, though she doubted anyone would bother answering a chained prisoner. To her surprise, Dorian actually glanced at her, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back toward the forest beyond the gate. He raised a hand, signaling his guards to remain at a distance, and stepped forward alone, his posture stiff with tension. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice carrying an authority Elena recognized, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "I know you are there." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged, tall and composed, wrapped in the same dark traveling cloak Elena remembered from the night before. Cale stepped into the morning light, and this time, he did not hesitate at the boundary of the gate. He crossed it without pause, entering Ashfall territory, as though he had every right in the world to do so. Dorian's guards tensed visibly, several reaching for weapons, but Dorian himself raised a hand sharply, stopping them before they could act. His eyes were fixed on Cale, with an expression Elena had never seen her Alpha wear before: recognition, and beneath it, unmistakable fear. "My king," Dorian said, and the words landed on Elena like a physical blow. He dropped immediately to one knee, his guards following suit, a heartbeat later, heads bowed, bodies tense, with a deference that bordered on terror. Elena stared, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. King, the man who had crouched at her gate 2 nights in a row, who had offered her water with his own hands, and spoken to her with quiet gentleness, was the Alpha King, the ruler over every pack in the northern lands, the figure spoken of only in hushed, reverent whispers around Ashfall's fires. Cale did not acknowledge Dorian's kneeling form immediately. His silver eyes moved instead toward Elena, taking in the chains, the exhaustion still etched into her face despite the brief rest she had managed, and something hardened visibly in his expression, before he finally turned his full attention to the kneeling Alpha. "Rise," Cale said, his voice carrying none of the softness Elena remembered from their conversations. This was a different version of him entirely, cold and commanding, every word carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "And explain to me why a member of your pack has been left chained at your gate for 2 full days and nights, without food, exposed to the elements, for a crime you have not even bothered to properly investigate." Dorian rose slowly, his face still pale, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "My king, I was unaware you were traveling through these lands. Had you known, you would have hidden this from me more carefully," Cale interrupted, his tone sharp as a blade. "That much is clear enough. I did not ask for excuses about your ignorance of my presence. I asked why this woman has been treated this way." Garrick stepped forward hesitantly, clearly hoping to salvage the situation. "My king, she was found guilty of theft from the pack's winter stores. The punishment is within our right as a sovereign pack to determine our own. I am well aware of what authority individual packs hold," Cale said, cutting him off with a look that made even the seasoned Beta flinch. "I am also well aware of what authority I hold over all of you, when that authority is called upon by injustice." He paused, letting the words settle heavily over the courtyard before continuing. "I have spent 2 nights observing this situation. I have listened to this woman's account. I have seen the marks on her wrists, the exhaustion in her body, the fear that surrounds every member of your pack whenever they speak of your leadership. Do not insult me by pretending this is a simple matter of pack discipline." Elena watched, stunned into silence, as her Alpha, a man who had never once shown her anything beyond stern indifference, now stood visibly shaken before this new, harder version of the man she had spoken with in the dark. "Release her," Cale commanded, his eyes flicking toward the guards still frozen near the gate. Now. One of the guards scrambled forward immediately, fumbling with the chains binding Elena's wrists to the post. His hands trembled as he worked, clearly terrified of moving too slowly under the king's watchful gaze. Within moments, the heavy iron fell away, and for the first time in 2 days, Elena's arms were free. She tried to rise, but her legs, stiff and weak from hours of kneeling, buckled beneath her. Before she could fall, Kale was there, moving with a speed that seemed almost impossible for someone his size, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were steady and strong around her, and despite everything, despite the shock of learning his true identity, Elena felt something in her chest ease slightly at the contact, some instinct recognizing safety, even as her mind struggled to catch up with everything happening around her. "Easy," Kale said quietly, his voice softening again now that his attention had shifted fully to her. "You are safe now." Elena looked up at him, still processing, still trying to reconcile the gentle stranger from the gate with the commanding king who had just brought her entire pack to its knees with a handful of sentences. "You're the Alpha King," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. "I am," he confirmed simply. "You never told me." "No," he admitted. "I should have. I apologize for that." Behind them, Dorian cleared his throat, clearly desperate to regain some measure of control over the situation, though his voice remained noticeably unsteady. "My king, if I had known this woman held any significance, I assure you." "She holds significance because she is a member of your pack," Kale said, not bothering to look at him, his focus remaining on Elena as he helped steady her on her feet. That alone should have been enough. The fact that it was not tells me everything I need to know about how Ashfall treats those without power or connection. Dorian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, clearly recognizing the danger of arguing further with a king whose patience had already worn thin. Kale finally turned his attention back to the Alpha, his expression settling into something cold and deliberate. "I will be remaining in Ashfall territory for the time being. I intend to understand fully how this situation came to pass, and I expect complete cooperation from every member of your leadership. Anyone found to have participated in a false accusation against this woman will answer to me directly. Is that understood?" "Understood, my king," Dorian said quietly, his eyes briefly flicking toward Elena with an expression she could not quite read, something between resentment and grudging reassessment. Vesper had appeared at some point during the confrontation, standing near the edge of the courtyard, her face carefully composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of panic that Elena did not miss. Kale's gaze found her briefly, lingering just long enough to make her visibly uncomfortable, before he turned his attention away, seemingly satisfied for now, with the fear he had already instilled. "Someone will see to it that she receives food, water, and proper rest," Kale said, addressing Garrick directly. "I will check on her condition myself later today. I expect to find her well cared for." "Of course, my king," Garrick said quickly, gesturing for one of the pack's healers to step forward from the gathered crowd. As the healer approached, a middle-aged woman named Old Marta, who Elena vaguely recognized from occasional visits to treat minor injuries, Kale finally released his supportive hold on Elena, though he remained close, watching carefully as Marta assessed her condition. "You'll need rest, food, and warmth," Marta said briskly, though not unkindly, examining the raw marks on Elena's wrists with a frown. "And these need tending before they become infected. Come, child, let's get you inside." Elena allowed herself to be led away, though she glanced back once toward Kale, who remained standing near the gate, his silver eyes following her, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite her exhaustion. He offered her a small nod, something reassuring in the gesture, before turning back to address Dorian and Garrick, with a tone that promised the conversation was far from finished. As Marta guided her toward the healer's quarters, Elena caught fragments of hushed conversation, rippling through the pack members, who had gathered to witness the extraordinary events unfolding at their gate. Whispers of disbelief, of shock, of questions no one seemed able to answer. Why had the Alpha King himself intervened on behalf of an unranked Omega? What connection could possibly exist between someone as powerful as Kale and someone as overlooked as Elena? She did not have answers to those questions either. Not yet. But as she settled onto a soft cot inside the healer's quarters for the first time in 2 days, finally able to rest without the bite of iron chains against her skin, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the strange intensity in Kale's eyes, to the protective urgency in his voice when he had caught her before she fell, to the quiet promise in his words that this was far from over. Marta worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the raw skin at Elena's wrists, before bringing a simple but warm meal that Elena ate slowly, savoring each bite after the long deprivation of the previous days. The older woman said little, though her eyes occasionally flicked toward Elena with an expression of quiet curiosity, clearly wondering the same things everyone else in the pack seemed to be wondering. "You've caused quite a stir," Marta finally said, breaking the comfortable silence as she gathered her supplies to leave. "The Alpha King himself, intervening for someone like you. I've served this pack for 30 years and never witnessed anything like it. I don't understand it either," Elena admitted honestly. "I only spoke with him briefly, before I knew who he was." Marta studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in her weathered face. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the universe recognizes things before we do. Rest now, child. Whatever this is, you'll need your strength for it." Elena did not fully understand what the healer meant, but exhaustion soon pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real rest she had managed since the chains first closed around her wrists 2 long nights ago. Outside, the pack continued to buzz with confusion and speculation, while within the pack house, Kale remained locked in a tense conversation with Dorian and Garrick, uncovering layer after layer of the corruption he had suspected from the moment he first arrived in Ashfall territory. While Elena rested, Kale stood in Dorian's private study, a room lined with old wooden shelves and faded maps of the Northern Territories. Garrick stood near the window, his arms crossed tightly, while Dorian remained seated behind his desk, looking considerably smaller than he had at the height of his authority in the courtyard. "Tell me exactly how this accusation came to be made," Kale said, his voice calm now, though the calm carried its own kind of danger. "Who first claimed to have found evidence against her?" Dorian hesitated, glancing briefly at Garrick before answering. "It was brought to my attention by my beta. Food from the winter stores was discovered hidden near her cabin. The evidence seemed clear enough at the time." "Seemed clear," Kale repeated, his tone sharpening. "Did anyone witness her taking anything? Did anyone question her directly before condemning her to 2 nights chained at your gate?" "The evidence was compelling," Garrick said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It was found by my daughter, who reported it to me immediately." "Your daughter," Kale said slowly, something clicking into place behind his sharp gaze. "The same daughter who visited Elena at the gate yesterday morning, according to my own observation, and left her with words that sounded considerably more like a threat than an expression of concern." Garrick's composure faltered slightly. "Vesper would have no reason to fabricate such a claim, my king. She has always been loyal to this pack." "Loyalty and honesty are not always the same thing," Kale said. "I want to speak with her directly. And I want every guard who was present when the evidence was supposedly discovered brought before me as well. If this accusation was fabricated, I will know before the day is finished, and I will hold accountable everyone who allowed an innocent woman to suffer for it." Dorian's face had grown increasingly pale throughout the conversation, the weight of Kale's scrutiny clearly bearing down on him in ways he had not anticipated when he woke that morning. "My king, if there has been some error in judgment, I assure you it will be corrected swiftly." "See that it is," Kale said, "because I intend to remain in this territory until I am satisfied that the truth has been fully uncovered, and Ashfall's reputation, along with your own position as its alpha, will depend entirely on how honestly you cooperate with that process." Within the hour, Vesper was brought before Kale, her earlier composure noticeably strained as she stood in the study, flanked by her father, who could no longer hide the anxiety etched across his features. Kale studied her carefully, the same piercing attention he had turned on Elena during their first conversation at the gate, though this time it carried none of the warmth. "Tell me how you discovered the stolen food," he said simply. "I found it near her cabin," Vesper said, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in her posture. "Hidden beneath some fallen branches, not far from her door." "And what were you doing near her cabin in the first place?" Kale asked. "It sits at the edge of the territory, some distance from the pack house, from what I have observed." Vesper hesitated, just slightly, before answering. "I was walking. I often walk that path." "A convenient coincidence," Kale said, his tone making it clear he did not believe her for a moment. "Tell me, does anyone else in this pack recall seeing you walk that particular path with any regularity before yesterday?" The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words could have. Vesper's eyes flickered toward her father, seeking some kind of support, but Garrick remained silent, clearly unwilling to defend a claim he could no longer be certain was true. Cale let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of it to settle fully before speaking again. "I will discover the truth eventually," he said quietly. "Whether it comes from your own admission now, or from a more thorough investigation later, matters little to me, except in how it will affect the consequences you face. I suggest you consider carefully which path serves you better." Vesper's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flicker of genuine fear breaking through her careful mask. But she said nothing further, and Cale, recognizing that she would not confess so easily, dismissed her from the room, with instructions that she was not to leave the pack's territory, under any circumstances, until his investigation concluded. Once she had gone, Cale turned back to Dorian and Garrick, his expression unreadable. "I will find the truth," he said simply, "and when I do, I expect this pack to accept whatever consequences that truth demands, regardless of rank or family connection. Is that understood?" Both men nodded, though neither looked particularly reassured by the promise. Cale left the study soon after, stepping out into the cool afternoon air, his mind already turning toward the small healer's quarters where Elena rested, and toward the questions that had been building steadily within him since the moment their eyes first met across that iron gate 2 nights before. Elena woke to soft afternoon light filtering through the small window of the healer's quarters, her body still heavy with exhaustion despite the hours of rest. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot everything that had happened, until the dull ache in her wrists reminded her sharply of the chains, the cold, and the strange king who had appeared to end her suffering. A quiet knock sounded at the door before it opened, and old Marta stepped inside, carrying a fresh tray of food. Behind her, unmistakably, stood Cale, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression softening the moment his eyes found Elena awake and alert. "You're looking better," Marta said briskly, setting the tray down on a small table beside the cot. "Eat slowly. Your body needs time to recover properly." Elena sat up carefully, murmuring her thanks, as Marta busied herself checking the bandages on her wrists once more. Cale remained near the doorway, watching with the same quiet intensity Elena remembered from their conversations at the gate, though now, in the daylight, without the shadows of the forest between them, she could see him more clearly than before. He looked younger than she had first assumed, though something in the way he carried himself suggested a weight of experience far beyond his years. "May I speak with her alone?" Cale asked Marta, his tone respectful despite his rank. Marta glanced between them, something knowing in her expression, before nodding and gathering her supplies to leave. "Don't tire her out, my king. She needs rest, not more excitement." Once the door closed behind her, Cale stepped further into the room, taking a seat on the small wooden stool beside the cot. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable rather than awkward, filled with everything that had passed between them over the last 2 days. "How are you feeling?" Cale finally asked. "Better," Elena admitted, confused mostly. "I still don't fully understand why any of this happened. Why you intervened. Why you even noticed me at all." Cale's expression grew thoughtful, and he reached carefully for her hand, his touch gentle as he turned her wrist over, examining the bandages Marta had applied. Elena tensed slightly at the contact, though not from discomfort, something warmer and more complicated stirring in her chest instead. "There is something I need to show you," Cale said quietly, "though I confess I do not entirely know how to explain it in a way that will not sound impossible." "Try me," Elena said. "After everything that has happened in the last 2 days, I think I can handle impossible." Cale carefully unwrapped a small section of the bandage near the base of her wrist, revealing a patch of skin that had been hidden beneath the fabric. Elena frowned, looking down at her own arm, at a faint crescent-shaped mark she had carried since birth, one she had never given much thought to beyond assuming it was simply an ordinary birthmark, unremarkable and unimportant. "This mark," Cale said, his voice careful and measured. "Do you know its origin? Has anyone in your family spoken of it?" Elena shook her head slowly. "My mother had one similar, I think, though smaller. She never spoke much about where it came from. Why? What does it mean? Kale was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes fixed on the mark with an intensity that made Elena's pulse quicken. There is an old prophecy, he began slowly, known only within the royal bloodline of the Alpha Kings, passed down through many generations. It speaks of a mark, exactly like this one, that will appear on the one destined to stand as Luna beside the king who carries the corresponding sign. Elena's breath caught. Luna, she repeated, the word feeling strange and enormous in her mouth. You mean the king's mate, his queen? Yes, Kale confirmed quietly. I have carried my own mark since birth, here. He pulled back the sleeve of his own shirt, revealing a similar crescent shape on the inside of his forearm, slightly larger than hers but unmistakably matching in design. I have carried it my entire life, never expecting to find its match. Many in my line believed the prophecy was simply legend, a story without true substance behind it. Elena stared at the matching marks, her mind struggling to process the implications of what Kale was telling her. You're saying that I am saying that the moment I first saw you at that gate, something within me recognized you before I understood why, Kale said, his voice softer now, stripped of the commanding authority he had shown Dorian and Garrick. I told myself it was simply concern for injustice that kept drawing me back to you. But when I examined your wrist just now, and saw this mark clearly for the first time, I understood there was something far deeper at work. Elena pulled her hand back gently, not from rejection, but from the overwhelming weight of everything she was trying to absorb. This is a lot to take in, she said honestly. 2 days ago, I was an unranked Omega with no family, punished for a crime I didn't commit. Now you're telling me I might be destined to become… what, exactly? Your Luna? Queen over territories I've never even seen? I understand this is overwhelming, Kale said gently. I do not expect you to simply accept it without question, or without time to consider what it might mean. The mark confirms a connection between us, one written into ancient bloodline magic, but it does not erase your right to choose how you wish to move forward. I would never force such a role upon anyone, regardless of what prophecy claims. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity, along with something else she could not quite name, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with the powerful king who had brought her entire pack to its knees just hours before. Why does this feel so strange? She said slowly, and yet somehow not entirely surprising, as though some part of me already sensed something the moment I saw you at the gate, before I even knew your name. I felt the same, Kale admitted. I have ruled for many years, Elena. I have met countless wolves, faced countless decisions, built walls around myself that few have ever managed to breach. And yet within moments of seeing you chained at that gate, something in me shifted, in a way I still do not fully understand. They sat together in silence for a while, the weight of everything settling slowly between them, neither rushing to fill the quiet with more words. Elena found herself studying the mark on her wrist with new eyes, tracing its faint outline with her finger, trying to reconcile the ordinary birthmark she had carried her entire life, with the extraordinary meaning Kale had just revealed. What happens now? She finally asked. If this prophecy is real, if we truly are meant to be bonded in this way, what does that actually mean for my life? For yours? For now, Kale said carefully, it means nothing changes, except what you choose to allow. I still intend to uncover the truth behind your false accusation, to hold accountable those responsible for your suffering. Beyond that, I hope you will allow me the chance to know you properly, without the weight of prophecy forcing any decision before you are ready to make it. Elena appreciated the sentiment more than she could easily express, the careful respect in his words, a stark contrast to the way her own pack had treated her choices, or lack thereof, throughout her entire life. I would like that, she said quietly. Getting to know you, I mean, properly, without chains or gates between us. A small, genuine smile touched Kale's face, softening his sharp features in a way that made something warm unfurl in Elena's chest. Then that is where we will begin, he said. Their conversation was interrupted by a firm knock at the door, followed by the entrance of one of Kale's own guards, a serious-looking wolf named Corwin who had apparently traveled separately and only just arrived in Ashfall territory, upon hearing of the king's presence there. He bowed respectfully before delivering his message. My king, we have gathered the guards who were present during the initial discovery of the stolen goods, as you requested. Additionally, one of them has come forward with information he claims is relevant to the investigation. Kale's expression sharpened immediately, the gentleness from their conversation giving way once more to the focused authority Elena had witnessed earlier. Bring him to the study. I will hear what he has to say immediately. He turned back to Elena, his expression softening again as he addressed her directly. Rest and recover your strength. I will return once I have learned more, and we will speak further about everything we have discussed today. Elena nodded, watching as he rose, and followed Corwin out of the room, leaving her alone once more with her thoughts, her recovering body, and the strange, impossible weight of the crescent mark on her wrist that had suddenly transformed from an unremarkable birthmark into something that might reshape the entire course of her future. She leaned back against the cot, staring up at the wooden ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. 2 days ago, she had been utterly alone in the world, chained and humiliated, with no one to speak on her behalf. Now she found herself potentially bound by ancient prophecy to the most powerful wolf in the northern lands, a man whose gentleness in private seemed entirely at odds with the commanding fear he inspired in everyone around him. It should have felt overwhelming, and in many ways it did. But beneath the confusion and uncertainty, Elena recognized something else stirring within her, something she had not felt in a very long time: hope. Meanwhile, in Dorian's study, Kale listened carefully as a young guard named Petrin, visibly nervous but determined, laid out what he had witnessed 2 nights before the accusation was made public. I was on watch near the northern boundary, Petran said, his hands twisting together anxiously in front of him. I saw Miss Vesper moving through the storehouse late at night, well after the usual hours. I did not think much of it at the time. It is not unusual for the Betas family to have access to the stores. But you thought of it later, Kale said, his tone encouraging the young guard to continue. Yes, my king. The following morning, when the accusation against Elena was announced, I remembered what I had seen, and found it strange that food would go missing the same night Miss Vesper was near the stores. I did not say anything at first. I was afraid of the consequences of accusing the Beta's daughter without proof. And now? Kale asked. Petrin straightened slightly, though his nervousness remained visible. Now I believe an innocent woman was punished for something she did not do, and I could not live with staying silent any longer, regardless of the risk to myself. Kale studied the young guard for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his sharp gaze. Your honesty will not go unrewarded, he said. Nor will it go unpunished, should this pack attempt to retaliate against you for speaking the truth. I will ensure your protection personally. Dorian, seated heavily behind his desk throughout the exchange, looked increasingly troubled, the full weight of what his pack had done finally settling over him. My king, if this account is accurate, then I have failed gravely in my duty as Alpha. I allowed a false accusation to stand without proper investigation, and an innocent member of my pack suffered greatly as a result. Yes, Kale said simply, offering no comfort or reassurance. You did. Garrick, standing near the window throughout the testimony, had grown increasingly pale, clearly grappling with the growing likelihood that his own daughter had orchestrated the entire scheme. My king, he said carefully, if Vesper is indeed responsible, I assure you I had no knowledge of her actions. I would never condone such cruelty. Whether you condoned it or simply failed to notice it happening beneath your own roof is a question you will need to answer for yourself, Kale said. But your daughter's actions will require a direct explanation, and I intend to have one before this day ends. He turned back to Petrin, offering a small nod of genuine gratitude. Thank you for your courage in coming forward. You may return to your duties, though I would ask that you remain available should further questions arise. Once Petrin had departed, Kale turned his full attention back to Dorian and Garrick, his expression hardening once more. I want Vesper brought before me again, immediately, and this time, I expect the truth, not carefully worded evasions. Within the hour, Vesper stood once more in the study, her composure considerably more fragile than during their earlier conversation. She had clearly heard, through whatever channels information traveled within the pack, that a witness had come forward, and the knowledge had visibly shaken whatever confidence remained in her earlier denials. I have a witness, Kale said without preamble, who saw you near the storehouse, the same night the food supposedly went missing from Elena's possession. I will ask you once more, and I expect complete honesty this time. Did you fabricate this accusation against her? Vesper's hands trembled slightly at her sides, and for a long moment she said nothing, clearly weighing the consequences of continued denial against the mounting evidence stacked against her. Finally, her shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of her. Yes, she admitted quietly, the single word landing heavily in the tense silence of the study. I took the food myself and hid it near her cabin. I wanted her gone from the pack, or at least broken enough that she would never cause me trouble again. Trouble, Kale repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What trouble has she ever caused you? Vesper's jaw tightened, old resentment flickering behind her eyes. She has always managed to survive without anyone's help, without complaint, without ever needing anything from the rest of us. Everyone always spoke of her quiet strength, her resilience, while I struggled constantly to prove myself worthy of my father's position. I could not stand it any longer, watching her earn respect she never even seemed to want, while I fought for every scrap of approval I received. Kale studied her for a long moment, something almost like understanding flickering briefly across his sharp features, though it did nothing to soften the judgment in his voice. Jealousy is no excuse for cruelty, he said. You will face consequences for what you have done. Consequences determined not simply by your father's authority as Beta, but by my own judgment as king. Elena's suffering will not go unanswered. Vesper said nothing further, her earlier defiance completely extinguished, replaced by a resigned acceptance of whatever punishment awaited her. Kale dismissed her from the study, instructing the guards to keep her confined to her family's quarters, until he determined an appropriate response to her actions. As the study emptied, Kale remained standing near the window for a long moment, staring out toward the healer's quarters where Elena rested, unaware that the truth behind her false accusation had finally, fully come to light. He felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction at uncovering the truth and renewed anger at the cruelty she had endured for something as petty as jealousy. He resolved, in that quiet moment, that he would do everything within his considerable power to ensure Elena never again suffered such treatment, whether from Ashfall or from any pack under his rule. Whatever the prophecy meant for their future together, he intended to honor it not through obligation, but through genuine care for the remarkable woman he had discovered chained at a gate, meant to keep danger out, when the true danger, it turned out, had been hiding within the pack's own walls all along. 3 days after the truth came fully to light, Kale called every member of the Ashfall pack to gather in the central courtyard, the same space where Elena had once been condemned and chained, without a single voice raised in her defense. This time, the courtyard filled with a very different energy, tense anticipation mixing with lingering shock at everything that had unfolded since the king's unexpected arrival. Elena stood near the front of the gathering, her strength largely recovered, though the memory of those 2 cold nights remained fresh in her mind, impossible to fully shake, despite the care she had received in the days since. She wore simple clothing, nothing elaborate, though Marta had insisted on mending the small tears and cleaning the fabric until it looked far more presentable than anything Elena had owned in years. Kale stood at the top of the stone steps, the same place where Dorian had once announced her punishment, though his presence there carried an entirely different weight. Beside him stood Dorian, visibly humbled, and slightly apart, under guard, stood Vesper and Garrick, both stripped of the confidence they had carried just days before. People of Ashfall, Kale began, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. 3 nights ago, I arrived in your territory, following rumors of injustice within this pack's leadership. What I discovered exceeded even my worst expectations. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered crowd, meeting eyes that quickly dropped away, unable to hold his scrutiny. An innocent woman was chained at your gate, left without food or water, punished for a crime, fabricated out of petty jealousy, by someone who should have known better. And not a single person among you stepped forward to question the judgment, to demand proof, to show even the smallest measure of compassion for someone in obvious distress. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shame evident in the downcast eyes and shifting postures of those gathered. Elena watched, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and discomfort at being the center of such public attention, something she had spent her entire life carefully avoiding. I have spoken with Alpha Dorian at length regarding the failures of leadership that allowed this injustice to occur, Kale continued. Effective immediately, Vesper, daughter of Beta Garrick, is stripped of any privileges within this pack, and will serve a period of labor, under close supervision, atoning for the suffering she deliberately caused an innocent member of her own community. Beta Garrick will remain in his position, though under close observation, as penance for his failure to properly investigate claims made against a defenseless member of his pack. Vesper's face remained carefully blank, though Elena could see the tension in her rigid posture, the humiliation of her punishment being announced so publicly before the entire pack she had once expected to inherit influence within. As for you, Kale said, turning his attention to Dorian, your leadership will be reviewed carefully in the coming months. Should further evidence of favoritism or injustice surface within your pack, your position as Alpha will be reconsidered entirely. Ashfall exists under my protection, and that protection extends to every member of this pack, regardless of rank or family connection. I expect that lesson to be remembered clearly from this day forward. Dorian bowed his head, accepting the judgment without argument, clearly aware that any protest would only worsen his already precarious standing. Kale's expression shifted then, the hard authority softening slightly as his gaze finally settled on Elena, standing quietly near the front of the crowd. He extended a hand toward her, a silent invitation, and though her heart pounded with sudden nervousness, Elena stepped forward, climbing the stone steps to stand beside him, before the entire gathered pack. There is one more matter I wish to address, Kale said, his voice carrying a different quality now, something more personal beneath the formal authority. 3 nights ago, I encountered Elena, chained at this very gate, and something within me recognized her, before I fully understood why. Upon closer examination, I discovered she carries a mark passed down through ancient prophecy, within my own bloodline. A mark that identifies her as my destined Luna. The courtyard erupted into startled whispers, disbelief evident on every face turned toward them. Elena felt her cheeks flush under the sudden weight of so many eyes, though she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to shrink beneath the attention the way she might have done in earlier days. I understand this revelation comes as a shock, Kale continued, particularly given the circumstances under which we met. But I wish to be clear before all of you. Elena will be treated with the respect and honor befitting her position, not because prophecy demands it, but because she has proven, through unimaginable adversity, a strength and dignity that few among you demonstrated when she needed it most. Elena glanced at him, surprised by the directness of his words, the way he seemed determined to use this moment not simply to announce a personal connection, but to underscore the failures of the pack that had so thoroughly failed her. She appreciated it more than she could easily express, the validation of everything she had endured finally being acknowledged so publicly. I do not require your approval or understanding to honor this bond, Kale said, addressing the crowd directly. But I would ask that you consider, in the days ahead, how your treatment of those without rank or connection reflects on the true character of this pack. Elena deserved compassion long before any prophecy revealed her significance to me. That she received cruelty instead speaks to something that must change, not just here in Ashfall, but across every territory under my protection. He turned to Elena then, his expression softening further as he addressed her directly, though his voice still carried enough that those closest could hear. I do not ask you to accept this role simply because prophecy demands it. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove myself worthy of the trust such a bond requires, in whatever time you need to consider it properly. Elena studied him for a long moment, aware of the weight of every eye upon them, aware too of the strange, undeniable pull she had felt toward him since that first night at the gate, long before she understood what it meant. I would like that chance, she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard, to know you properly, and to see where this connection leads, without rushing toward conclusions neither of us have fully earned yet. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd at her measured response, several pack members clearly having expected something more dramatic, more immediately accepting given the magnitude of what had been announced. But Kale's expression showed only respect for her careful consideration, a small, genuine smile touching his features, despite the formal setting. Then that is precisely where we will begin, he said, echoing words he had spoken to her privately just days before. though now they carried the weight of a promise made before witnesses, a foundation being laid, not on obligation, but on mutual respect and genuine choice. The gathering slowly dispersed after that, pack members breaking into hushed conversations as they processed everything that had unfolded, the shocking revelation of Elena's connection to the Alpha King mixing with lingering discomfort over their own complicity in her earlier suffering. Several approached Elena hesitantly in the aftermath, offering awkward apologies for their silence during her punishment, though Elena accepted them with more grace than many of them likely deserved, understanding that fear of Dorian's authority had kept many from speaking out, even those who might have privately doubted the accusation against her. Old Marta approached last, her weathered face creased with a proud, knowing smile. "I told you the universe recognizes things before we do," she said, gently squeezing Elena's hand. "I'm glad to see I was right." Elena laughed softly, some of the tension of the day finally easing from her shoulders. "You did say something like that. I didn't fully believe you at the time." "Few do, until they've lived it themselves," Marta said. "Take care of yourself, child. Whatever path lies ahead of you now, I suspect it will not be an easy one, even with a king at your side." The warning lingered in Elena's mind as she watched the older woman walk away, joining the rest of the pack members returning to their daily routines, despite the extraordinary events that had unfolded that afternoon. She turned to find Kale watching her with quiet patience, apparently content to let her process everything at her own pace, rather than pressing her toward decisions she was not yet ready to make. "That was a lot," Elena finally said, running a hand through her hair, the weight of the public announcement still settling over her. "It was," Kale agreed. "I could have handled the revelation more privately, but I believed it important that this pack understand fully the consequences of their earlier treatment of you, and the significance you now hold, not just to me personally, but within the broader structure of the territories I oversee." "I understand," Elena said, and she genuinely did, appreciating the strategic wisdom behind his public declaration, even as the personal weight of it continued to settle over her. "What happens now? I assume I cannot simply continue living in my cabin at the edge of Ashfall's territory, not after everything that has been revealed today." Kale considered the question carefully before answering. "That decision remains entirely yours to make. I would be honored to have you accompany me to my own territory, where you would be safe, cared for, and given every opportunity to understand fully what a role as Luna might mean, should you choose eventually to accept it. But I will not force that choice upon you. If you wish to remain in Ashfall, under whatever protections I can arrange, that option remains available as well." Elena considered his words carefully, weighing the life she had known, however difficult it had often been, against the uncertain but undeniably significant path Kale was offering her. She thought of the cabin at the edge of the territory, quiet and familiar, but also isolated, a place that held as many painful memories now as comforting ones. She thought of the pack that had so easily condemned her, the fear and silence that had surrounded her suffering, until a stranger's intervention finally broke through it. And she thought of Kale himself, of the gentleness beneath his commanding authority, of the way he had listened to her, protected her, and now offered her genuine choice rather than simple obligation, despite holding more power than anyone she had ever encountered. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to see what lies beyond Ashfall's gates, for once in my life, rather than remaining chained to them, literally or otherwise." Kale's expression warmed considerably at her words, something like relief flickering behind his careful composure. "Then we will leave when you feel ready," he said. "There is no need to rush. Take whatever time you require to gather your belongings, to say whatever goodbyes feel necessary, and to prepare yourself properly for the journey ahead." Elena nodded, gratitude swelling within her chest at the continued respect he showed for her autonomy, even now, even after everything had been so publicly declared before the entire pack. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, whatever challenges the prophecy and her new role might eventually bring, she found herself trusting, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the path forward might genuinely lead somewhere better than the isolated, overlooked existence she had known within Ashfall's borders. As the sun began its slow descent over the territory that evening, painting the sky once more in shades of orange and deepening purple, Elena stood at the edge of the same gate where her ordeal had begun, though now the chains that had once bound her lay discarded and forgotten nearby. rusted iron replaced by something far more significant. She looked out toward the forest beyond, the same trees that had once concealed a mysterious black wolf watching over her through the darkest hours of her suffering, and felt, for the first time in years, something that felt remarkably like hope for whatever future awaited her beyond the borders of the only home she had ever known. The following morning, Elena made her way to the small cabin she had called home for the past 3 years, the modest wooden structure standing at the edge of the territory much as it always had, weathered but sturdy, surrounded by the quiet pines that had provided the only real companionship she had known since her parents passed. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of dried herbs and old wood greeting her, along with a wave of memories both comforting and painful. She began gathering her few belongings carefully, wrapping them in cloth bundles she could easily carry. There was not much: a handful of her mother's old cooking implements, a worn blanket her father had woven himself during the long winter evenings of her childhood, a small wooden box containing the few trinkets and letters that remained of her parents, the only proof she carried that she had once belonged to a family who loved her unconditionally, before illness had taken them both within the same difficult season. She sat for a long while on the edge of her narrow bed, holding the wooden box in her lap, tracing the familiar carvings on its lid with careful fingers. Her mother had given her this box on her final night, when the sickness had already claimed most of her strength, her voice barely more than a whisper as she pressed it into Elena's hands. "Whatever happens," her mother had said, "know that you carry more strength than you realize, more worth than anyone around you might recognize. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise, even when the world seems determined to overlook you." Elena had carried those words with her through 3 lonely years, through countless small cruelties and constant isolation, never quite believing them fully despite how desperately she wanted to. Now, holding the box once more, preparing to leave the only home she had known, for an uncertain future beside a king she had met only days before, she found herself finally beginning to understand what her mother had meant. A soft knock sounded at her door, and she looked up to find Cale standing in the doorway, having apparently walked the distance from the pack house himself, rather than sending someone to summon her. He glanced around the small cabin with obvious curiosity, though he said nothing about its modest size or simple furnishings, his expression carrying only quiet respect for the space that had clearly meant something significant to her. "I did not mean to intrude," he said. "I only wished to check on how you were managing." "You're not intruding," Elena said, offering him a small smile, as she rose from the bed, still holding the wooden box carefully. "I was just finishing gathering what I wished to bring with me." Cale's gaze moved to the box in her hands, curiosity evident, though he did not press for explanation. "Whatever you need to bring, we will ensure it arrives safely," he said. "There is no need to leave behind anything that matters to you." Elena appreciated the sentiment, though she glanced around the small cabin one final time, recognizing that most of what surrounded her, the furniture, the simple decorations, the small garden she had tended just outside the door, would remain behind regardless. This place had been her sanctuary during difficult years, but it had never truly felt like home, not in the way her mother's stories described home feeling. Perhaps, she thought, that particular feeling still awaited her somewhere beyond Ash Fall's borders. "Tell me about your territory," she said, curiosity finally overtaking the quiet melancholy of packing up her old life. "What should I expect when we arrive?" Cale's expression brightened slightly at the question, clearly pleased by her genuine interest. "My territory is considerably larger than Ashfall," he said. "The main court sits within a valley, surrounded by mountains, protected on nearly every side by natural barriers that have kept it safe for generations. The pack house itself was built by my grandfather, expanded by my father, and now serves not only as my home, but as the gathering place for representatives from every territory under my protection." "That sounds," Elena paused, searching for the right word, "overwhelming." Cale's mouth curved into a small, understanding smile. "It can be, particularly at first, but you will not be expected to navigate it entirely alone. I intend to introduce you gradually, to allow you time to adjust before any formal expectations are placed upon you." "And the other wolves there?" Elena asked carefully. "How will they react to my presence? I am not exactly the kind of Luna most would expect, given my rank, my lack of family connections, my background." Something flickered across Cale's expression. a protective sharpness that reminded Elena briefly of the commanding authority he had shown Dorian and Garrick. "Anyone who treats you with anything less than the respect you deserve will answer directly to me," he said firmly. "Your worth is not determined by rank or family connection, Elena. It never has been, regardless of how Ashfall chose to treat you." Elena nodded slowly, grateful for the reassurance even as uncertainty continued to churn within her. She finished gathering the last of her belongings, tucking the wooden box carefully into a woven bag along with the rest, before taking one final look around the small cabin that had sheltered her through years of quiet solitude. "I think I'm ready," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with how steady her voice sounded, despite the enormity of the step she was about to take. Cale offered his arm, and Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting it, allowing him to guide her out of the cabin and back toward the pack house, where preparations for their journey were already well underway. As they walked, several pack members paused to watch them pass, their expressions a complicated mixture of curiosity, lingering shame, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Elena held her head high as she walked past the gate, where she had once knelt chained and humiliated, refusing to let the memory diminish the strength she felt now, standing beside a king who had seen worth in her, when her own pack had seen nothing but convenient blame. Whatever challenges awaited her beyond Ashfall's borders, she felt ready, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to face them without fear holding her back. The journey to Cale's territory took the better part of 3 days, traveling first by horseback along winding forest paths, then later through open valleys where the mountains that sheltered his lands finally came into view, tall and imposing against the horizon. Elena had never traveled so far from Ashfall in her entire life, and despite the uncertainty churning within her, she found herself captivated by the sheer beauty of the landscape unfolding around them. Cale rode beside her for most of the journey, accompanied by a small escort of trusted guards, including Corwin, who Elena had met briefly during the investigation into Vesper's scheme. The guards kept a respectful distance during most of the ride, allowing Cale and Elena the space to talk freely, to continue the slow process of learning about each other that had begun in those first quiet conversations at the gate. "Tell me about your childhood," Elena asked on the second day, as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear mountain stream. "What was it like, growing up, knowing you would one day rule over so much?" Cale considered the question for a long moment, staring out at the water as memories clearly surfaced behind his thoughtful expression. "Demanding," he said finally. "My father believed strongly in preparing me thoroughly for the responsibilities I would eventually inherit. There was little room for the ordinary carelessness of childhood. I was taught strategy, diplomacy, combat, and governance from a very young age." "That sounds lonely," Elena said softly, recognizing something familiar in his description despite their vastly different circumstances. "It was, in its own way," Cale admitted, "though I suspect my loneliness looked quite different from yours. I was never without company, never without resources or comfort. But genuine connection, the kind built on equal footing rather than deference to rank, proved considerably harder to find." Elena nodded, understanding more than she might have expected given how different their lives had been. "I think that's part of why this feels less strange than it probably should," she said. "We both know what it means to be surrounded by others and still feel entirely alone." Cale's gaze met hers, something warm and genuine passing between them, a recognition that went beyond the ancient prophecy binding their fates together. "Perhaps that is part of what the prophecy truly recognized," he said quietly. "Not simply a matching mark, but a shared understanding neither of us has found elsewhere." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the conversation flowing more easily between them with each passing hour, questions and answers building a foundation of familiarity that had begun tentatively at Ashfall's gate and now grew steadily stronger with every shared story, every small laugh, every moment of quiet understanding exchanged along the winding mountain paths. By the third day, they crested a final ridge, and Elena caught her first glimpse of Cale's territory spread out below them in the valley, more magnificent than she had imagined despite his earlier descriptions. The pack house sat at the center, an impressive structure of stone and timber, surrounded by smaller dwellings that stretched outward in organized clusters, all of it framed by the protective mountains rising on every side. "This is beautiful," Elena breathed, momentarily forgetting her nervousness in the face of such striking scenery. "I hope you will come to see it as home," Cale said quietly, watching her reaction with obvious hope. As they descended into the valley, word of their arrival had clearly spread ahead of them, and a crowd had gathered near the packhouse entrance, wolves of every rank curious to catch their first glimpse of the woman their king had claimed as his destined Luna. Elena felt her earlier confidence waver slightly under the weight of so many curious eyes, memories of Ashfall's harsh judgment resurfacing, despite her best efforts to remain composed. Cale seemed to sense her sudden tension, reaching over to gently squeeze her hand before they dismounted. "You do not need to prove anything to anyone here," he said quietly. "Take whatever time you need to settle in properly." The following weeks passed in a careful, deliberate rhythm, as Elena adjusted to her new surroundings. Cale assigned her comfortable quarters within the packhouse, spacious rooms that felt almost absurdly luxurious, compared to the modest cabin she had left behind, though she found herself gradually growing more comfortable with the unfamiliar comfort, rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. She met gradually with various members of Cale's court, some warmly welcoming, others more reserved, clearly uncertain how to treat someone whose position had been granted through prophecy, rather than earned through traditional means. Elena handled each interaction with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through her difficult years in Ashfall, refusing to let skepticism or subtle judgment shake her growing sense of belonging. One evening, several weeks into her time in Cale's territory, she found herself walking through the gardens behind the packhouse, enjoying the quiet solitude after a particularly long day of formal introductions to visiting representatives from neighboring territories. She had grown to appreciate these gardens, a peaceful retreat that reminded her, in small ways, of the quiet forest surrounding her old cabin. Cale found her there, settling beside her on a stone bench without needing to ask permission, their comfort with each other, having grown steadily over the weeks since their journey together. "You handled today well," he said. "Ambassador Thane can be particularly difficult to impress." "I'm not entirely certain I impressed him," Elena said with a small laugh. "But I survived the conversation without embarrassing either of us, which feels like a reasonable accomplishment." "You underestimate yourself," Cale said gently. "You have handled every challenge presented to you since arriving here, with more grace than many who were born into positions of privilege managed to display." Elena appreciated the compliment, though old insecurities still occasionally whispered doubts she found difficult to fully silence. "Sometimes I still worry," she admitted quietly, "that I do not truly belong here, that everyone can see, beneath the fine clothing and careful lessons in etiquette, the same overlooked Omega who was chained at a gate just weeks ago." Cale turned to face her fully, his expression serious and genuinely concerned. "Elena, look at me," he said softly, waiting until her eyes met his before continuing. "You belong here because of who you are, not despite where you came from. The strength you carried through years of isolation, the dignity you maintained, even while chained and humiliated, the courage you showed standing before this entire pack when your accuser finally confessed her cruelty. These are not qualities that vanish simply because your circumstances have changed. They are the very reasons I recognized something extraordinary in you, from the moment we first met." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the weight of genuine validation settling over her in a way that felt entirely different from the empty compliments she had occasionally received throughout her difficult years in Ashfall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing that in me, even when I struggle to see it myself." Cale reached over, gently brushing away a single tear that had escaped down her cheek, his touch tender, despite the strength she knew resided within him. "I will keep reminding you," he said quietly, "for as long as you need to hear it, until you believe it as fully as I do." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple that reminded Elena of that first difficult night, chained at Ashfall's gate, though now the memory carried far less pain than it once had, softened by everything that had grown between them since. She found herself, in that quiet moment, beginning to genuinely believe that whatever the ancient prophecy had intended, the bond forming between them was built on something far more solid than mere fate. It was built on patience, respect, and a growing trust that neither of them had experienced so fully before. As days turned into weeks, Elena began taking on small responsibilities within the court, first simply observing Kale's meetings with various pack representatives, then gradually offering her own perspective on matters that arose. Her years of quiet observation in Ashfall, watching how power operated from the margins, proved unexpectedly valuable, giving her insights into the concerns of ordinary pack members that many within Kale's court, born into privilege, had never fully considered. Kale noticed this quickly and began actively seeking her opinion during discussions of policy and governance, valuing her perspective in ways that gradually earned her genuine respect among even the most skeptical members of his court. What had begun as curious, sometimes wary observation, slowly transformed into recognition of her capability, her fairness, and her genuine care for those without power or connection, qualities that mirrored, in many ways, the reputation Kale himself had built through years of just and thoughtful rule. Elena still thought occasionally of Ashfall, of the cabin she had left behind, of the pack members who had watched her suffering in silence for so long, but increasingly, those memories felt like echoes of a different life entirely, one that had shaped her into the woman she had become, but no longer defined the future stretching ahead of her. For the first time since her parents' passing, Elena felt something resembling genuine belonging, a sense that she had found not just safety and comfort, but a place where her presence truly mattered. She did not yet know that her growing peace would soon be threatened once more, that the shadow of Ashfall's cruelty had not fully released its grip on her fate, and that Vesper's jealousy, though punished, had not been entirely extinguished. But for now, in the quiet gardens of Kale's territory, watching the sunset beside a king who had chosen patience over demand, respect over obligation, Elena allowed herself simply to exist in the fragile, precious happiness she had never truly believed she deserved. Not everyone within Kale's court accepted her presence with the same openness Kale himself displayed. Among the most vocal skeptics was Lady Iris, a senior advisor who had served Kale's father before him and held considerable influence among the older members of the court. She approached Elena directly one afternoon, finding her alone in the packhouse library, poring over one of the many books Kale had encouraged her to explore as she continued learning about the history and governance of his territory. "You read well, for someone raised without formal education," Iris said, her tone carrying just enough condescension to make the compliment feel more like an insult. Elena looked up calmly, refusing to let the older woman's tone rattle her. "My mother taught me to read before she passed," she said evenly. She believed knowledge should never be denied, simply because circumstances made it difficult to obtain. Iris studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind her sharp eyes. "The king seems quite taken with you," she said. "Though I confess I struggle to understand what qualifies an unranked Omega from a minor territory to stand as Luna over lands as significant as these." "Perhaps nothing qualifies me, by your measure," Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the challenge clearly embedded in Iris's words. "But I did not seek this position, Lady Iris. It found me, in the form of a mark I carried since birth and never understood until recently. I intend to prove myself worthy of it through my actions, not through inherited privilege I never possessed." Something shifted subtly in Iris's expression, surprise flickering behind her earlier skepticism. "That is a more honest answer than I expected," she admitted grudgingly. "Very well. Prove yourself then. I will be watching closely." "I would expect nothing less," Elena replied, holding the older woman's gaze steadily, until Iris finally gave a small, reluctant nod and departed, leaving Elena alone once more with her books, though her heart pounded considerably faster than her calm exterior had suggested. She recounted the exchange to Kale later that evening, expecting perhaps sympathy or reassurance, but instead finding something closer to approval in his expression, as she described her response to Iris's pointed questions. "You handled that better than most would have," he said. "Iris has tested every significant figure who has entered this court for as long as I can remember. She tested me relentlessly, when I first inherited leadership from my father, certain I was not yet ready for the responsibility. Her approval, once earned, carries considerable weight among the rest of the court." "So I passed some manner of examination then," Elena said, a small smile touching her lips, despite the lingering nervousness from the encounter. "You did more than pass," Kale said, reaching over to take her hand gently. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of quiet strength that first drew me to you at that gate. Iris will come to respect you fully in time." as will the rest of the court, once they witness firsthand what I have known since our very first conversation." Elena squeezed his hand gratefully, appreciating once more the steady confidence he showed in her, even when her own doubts occasionally threatened to overwhelm her. Their relationship had grown steadily during the weeks since her arrival, evolving from careful, respectful distance into something warmer and more intimate, built on countless small moments of shared understanding rather than any grand declaration. They had not yet spoken formally of matters beyond friendship and mutual respect, both of them seemingly content to let their connection develop naturally, rather than forcing it toward conclusions neither felt fully ready to declare. But Elena found herself, increasingly, looking forward to their quiet evenings together, to the easy conversations that stretched long into the night, to the growing certainty that whatever the ancient prophecy had intended, the bond forming between them was becoming something she genuinely treasured, independent of fate or obligation. Word of her growing acceptance within Chaol's court gradually spread beyond the valley, carried through traders and travelers to neighboring territories, including, eventually, back to Ashfall itself, where a certain disgraced daughter of the Beta listened to the news with quiet, simmering resentment that her earlier punishment had done nothing to fully extinguish. Vesper's period of labor within Ashfall had done little to soften the bitterness that had driven her original scheme against Elena. If anything, the humiliation of her public exposure, combined with the loss of nearly all standing she had once held within the pack, had only deepened her resentment into something colder and more determined. She spent her days completing whatever menial tasks Dorian assigned her, and her nights plotting quietly, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim some measure of the power and respect she felt had been unjustly stripped away. That opportunity arrived several months later, in the form of a traveling merchant who passed through Ashfall, carrying news from the wider territories, including detailed accounts of Elena's growing acceptance within Chaol's court. Vesper listened carefully to every word, her mind already turning toward how she might use this information to her advantage. She approached the merchant privately that evening, offering him a modest sum in exchange for carrying a message to a specific destination, one she had considered carefully over the preceding weeks. The message was addressed to Alpha Ronan of the Thornwood Pack, a territory known for its uneasy relationship with Chaol's rule, one of the few packs that had occasionally chafed against the authority of the Alpha King, seeking greater independence than their current arrangement allowed. Vesper knew, from occasional gossip exchanged among traveling traders, that Ronan harbored ambitions of expanding his own influence, perhaps even challenging Chaol's authority should a sufficiently compelling opportunity present itself. A scandal involving the king's chosen Luna, someone whose humble origins and lack of proper lineage could be framed as unworthy of such an elevated position, might prove exactly the kind of leverage Ronan sought. Her message, carefully worded to avoid any direct implication of her own involvement, suggested that questions remained about the legitimacy of Elena's claimed prophetic mark, hinting at rumors that the entire situation had been engineered to elevate an ordinary Omega beyond her rightful station, through deception rather than genuine fate. It was not entirely a lie, Vesper reasoned to herself, simply a careful arrangement of half-truths designed to plant doubt where certainty had previously existed. Weeks passed before any response arrived, but eventually, word reached Vesper, delivered discreetly through the same merchant, that Alpha Ronan had taken considerable interest in her claims and intended to investigate further, potentially bringing the matter before a formal gathering of territorial leaders, where questions about Elena's legitimacy as Luna could be raised publicly, threatening not only her standing, but potentially destabilizing Chaol's authority itself, if enough doubt could be sown among the assembled alphas. Vesper allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she considered the seeds she had planted, confident that whatever consequences eventually followed, she would remain safely removed from any direct blame, her carefully worded message leaving no clear trail back to her own involvement. Meanwhile, within Chaol's territory, Elena remained entirely unaware of the scheme, quietly building against her, her days filled instead with the steady, comfortable rhythm of a life that had grown increasingly rich with purpose and connection. She had taken on greater responsibilities within the court, working closely with Chaol on matters of governance, and had earned, gradually, the genuine respect of even the most skeptical members of his advisory council, including Lady Iris, whose earlier condescension had softened considerably into something approaching genuine admiration. One particularly clear evening, Kale invited Elena to join him on a private balcony overlooking the valley, away from the usual bustle of court business, carrying with him a bottle of wine and an unusual nervousness that Elena had rarely witnessed in him before. "Is something wrong?" she asked, settling beside him at the balcony railing, immediately noticing the slight tension in his usually composed demeanor. "No," Kale said quickly, then paused, seeming to reconsider his answer. "Actually, perhaps. I find myself uncertain how to properly express something I have been considering for some time now." Elena watched him curiously, her own pulse quickening slightly at his unusual hesitation. "You can tell me anything," she said gently. "We've built enough trust between us for that, I think." Kale turned to face her fully, his silver eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "When I first found you at that gate," he began slowly, "I told myself my interest was simply concern for injustice, nothing more complicated than basic decency, demanding I intervene on behalf of someone clearly suffering unfairly. But even then, something deeper stirred within me, something I did not fully understand, until the mark on your wrist confirmed what my instincts had already begun to recognize." "The prophecy," Elena said softly. "The prophecy explained the connection," Kale agreed. "But what has grown between us since, through these months of conversation, of shared governance, of quiet evenings exactly like this one, that has become something far more significant than ancient bloodline magic alone could account for? I find myself, Elena, genuinely and completely in love with you, independent of any prophecy or destined bond. I would choose you even if the mark on your wrist had never existed." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that spread through her entire chest. "I feel the same," she admitted, her voice slightly unsteady with emotion. "I think, if I am honest, I began falling for you somewhere in those quiet conversations at Ashfall's Gate, long before either of us understood what connected us. Everything since has only deepened that feeling into something I never expected to find, not after everything I endured before you arrived." Kale reached for her hand, his expression carrying a vulnerability that Elena had rarely seen from the powerful king who commanded such authority over vast territories. "Then will you allow me to formally court you?" he asked, "not as prophecy demands, but as my own genuine choice? I wish to build toward a future together properly, with your full willing participation, rather than simply allowing fate to dictate our path forward." "Yes," Elena said without hesitation, a genuine smile breaking across her face despite the lingering tears. "I would like that very much." The following weeks brought a new tenderness to their relationship, small gestures of affection woven naturally into their daily routines, quiet moments stolen between the demands of governance and diplomacy that filled most of their days. Kale took to bringing her small gifts, nothing extravagant, simple wildflowers gathered during his morning runs through the surrounding forest, books he thought might interest her, small tokens that carried far more meaning through their thoughtfulness than their material value. Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely happy, the weight of her difficult past gradually loosening its grip as she embraced the life growing steadily around her. She had made friends among the court, including a young healer named Ren who had taken to spending afternoons with her discussing herbal remedies, and a former guard-turned-advisor named Fen, whose dry humor never failed to make her laugh during particularly long council meetings. It was Fen, actually, who first brought concerning news to Kale's attention, having heard whispers through his own network of contacts among neighboring territories that Alpha Ronan of Thornwood had been making unusual inquiries regarding the legitimacy of Elena's prophetic mark, questions that carried an edge suggesting more than simple curiosity. Kale listened carefully as Fen relayed what he had learned, his earlier contentment giving way to the familiar sharp focus Elena recognized from their earliest days together in Ashfall, the version of him that emerged whenever injustice or threat presented itself. "Ronan has never fully accepted the extent of my authority," Kale said, once Fen had finished his report. "This would not be the first time he has sought opportunities to challenge my position, though previous attempts have been considerably more subtle than public questions regarding Elena's legitimacy." "Do you think someone is deliberately feeding him this information?" Elena asked, a cold unease settling in her stomach as she considered the implications. "It seems likely," Kale said grimly. Ronan is ambitious, but not typically reckless enough to raise such questions without some source of information he believes credible. Someone wants to create doubt about your position, Elena, and I intend to discover exactly who. Fen cleared his throat carefully before offering his own theory. My king, given the timing and the specific nature of the doubts being raised, questioning lineage and legitimacy, rather than simply challenging your authority directly, I suspect this traces back to Ashfall. Someone there still harbors resentment over how the earlier situation resolved. Cale's expression darkened considerably at the suggestion, his mind clearly turning immediately toward Vesper, whose punishment, while significant, had perhaps not been severe enough to fully extinguish the jealousy that had originally driven her cruelty against Elena. I will send someone to investigate quietly, Cale said. If Ashfall is indeed the source of this scheme, I want proof before I act. Proof strong enough that no one can question the legitimacy of whatever consequences follow. Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety tightening within her chest, old fears resurfacing despite the months of growing security and belonging she had built within Cale's territory. What if Ronan brings this before the other alphas? She asked. What if they believe him, or at least believe there is enough doubt to question my position? Cale reached over, taking her hand firmly in his own, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. Then we will face that challenge together, with the same strength and truth that carried us through the injustice in Ashfall. I will not allow baseless accusations to threaten what we have built, Elena. I promise you that. Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady confidence, even as uncertainty continued to churn within her. She thought of everything she had already overcome, the chains, the humiliation, the long cold nights waiting for a rescue she never expected would come. If she had survived that, she reasoned, surely she could face whatever challenge Vesper's continued jealousy might still bring against her, especially with Cale standing firmly beside her rather than facing it entirely alone as she once had. But as the following days brought increasingly troubling reports of Ronan's growing interest in the matter, whispers spreading steadily among neighboring territories about questions regarding the legitimacy of the king's chosen Luna, Elena could not fully shake the unsettling feeling that the peace she had found within Cale's territory was about to be tested more severely than she had yet experienced, and that the true battle for her place beside Cale had only just begun. Cale dispatched Corwin quietly to Ashfall within days, instructing him to investigate discreetly rather than announcing his purpose, hoping to uncover the truth before Vesper, if indeed she was responsible, could cover her tracks any further. Corwin returned nearly 2 weeks later, his expression grave as he delivered his findings in a private meeting with Cale and Elena. I spoke carefully with several traders, who pass regularly between Ashfall and Thornwood, Corwin reported. One of them, after considerable persuasion, admitted to carrying a sealed message from someone within Ashfall to Alpha Ronan several months ago. He could not confirm the exact contents, but he described the woman who paid him for the delivery in enough detail that I am confident it was Vesper. Elena felt a fresh wave of frustration mixing with weary resignation. She truly will not stop, she said quietly. Even stripped of standing, even punished before the entire pack, she continues searching for ways to hurt me. Her resentment runs deeper than simple jealousy over rank, Cale said thoughtfully. I suspect it has become something closer to obsession, a refusal to accept that her actions carry lasting consequences she cannot simply scheme her way around. What do we do now? Elena asked. We have Corwin's account, but nothing definitive enough to present as proof before other alphas, should Ronan bring his questions to a formal gathering. Cale considered the problem carefully, his sharp mind already working through possible strategies. I will send word to Dorian, instructing him to question Vesper directly regarding this trader's account. If she confesses, or if sufficient evidence can be gathered through proper pack authority, we will have grounds to discredit whatever claims Ronan intends to bring forward. And if she does not confess, Elena asked, then we prepare to face Ronan's challenge directly, with truth and evidence on our side, rather than relying solely on confession, Cale said. I have no intention of allowing baseless scheming to threaten what we have built, Elena, regardless of how carefully Vesper attempts to hide her involvement. Word arrived from Ashfall within the month, carried by a messenger bearing Dorian's official seal. Vesper, confronted directly with the trader's testimony, had initially denied any involvement, but under continued pressure from her father, whose own position remained precarious following his earlier failures. She had eventually admitted to sending the message, though she continued to insist that her words had contained no outright lies, merely questions she believed deserved honest answers. "She believes herself justified even now," Elena said, reading through Dorian's detailed account with a mixture of disbelief and weary frustration. "After everything, she still cannot see the harm in what she has done. Some wolves struggle to recognize their own cruelty, even when it stares back at them plainly," Chaol said. But her admission, formally documented by Dorian and witnessed by several senior pack members, gives us exactly the evidence we need should Ronan attempt to press this matter publicly. Despite the relief of finally having concrete proof of Vesper's continued scheming, a deeper unease settled over Elena in the days that followed. Word soon reached them that Ronan had indeed decided to press forward with his challenge, calling for a formal gathering of territorial alphas within the coming weeks, where questions regarding the legitimacy of Elena's position as Luna would be raised officially, before witnesses whose collective judgment carried significant weight across the northern lands. "A gathering of this scale has not occurred in years," Lady Iris explained during a tense council meeting, called to discuss the coming challenge. "Every alpha under the King's protection will attend, along with their senior advisors. Whatever is decided there will carry lasting weight, both for Elena's position and for the perceived strength of the King's authority itself." Elena felt the full weight of what was coming settle heavily over her. This would not be a simple matter of correcting a false accusation within a single pack, as it had been in Ashfall. This would be a public reckoning before the collected leadership of every territory under Chaol's rule, her worthiness as Luna, and by extension the legitimacy of Chaol's own judgment in choosing her, laid bare for judgment by wolves who had never met her, who knew nothing of her character beyond second-hand rumors and Ronan's carefully seeded doubts. "I am frightened," Elena admitted quietly to Chaol that evening, the two of them alone in his private study, long after the rest of the court had retired for the night. "Not simply of losing my position, but of failing you, of becoming the very weakness Ronan hopes to exploit against your authority." Chaol pulled her gently into his arms, his embrace steady and reassuring, despite the uncertainty clouding both their thoughts. "You could never be a weakness, Elena," he said firmly. "Whatever happens at this gathering, know that I stand beside you completely, without hesitation or doubt. We will face Ronan's challenge together, and we will prevail, not through my authority alone, but through the truth of who you are, and everything you have already overcome, to stand where you stand today." Elena drew what comfort she could from his words, though the weight of the coming gathering continued to press heavily upon her in the days that followed, each one bringing them closer to a confrontation that would test not only her own resolve, but the very foundation of the bond she and Chaol had built together, through months of patient trust and growing love. The great hall within Chaol's packhouse had been transformed for the gathering. Long tables arranged to accommodate the numerous alphas and their advisors, traveling from every territory under the King's protection. Elena stood near a side entrance, watching the hall slowly fill with unfamiliar faces, many of them regarding her with open curiosity, some with clear skepticism already evident in their expressions before she had spoken a single word in her own defense. Chaol had explained the proceedings carefully, in the days leading up to the gathering. Ronan would present his questions and concerns formally before the assembled alphas. Elena and Chaol would have the opportunity to respond, presenting whatever evidence and testimony they had gathered to counter the doubts being raised. At the conclusion, the gathered alphas would offer their collective judgment, though ultimately the final decision regarding Elena's position would remain with Chaol himself, given his authority as king. Still, the perception and support of the other territorial leaders carried significant weight, both for Elena's standing and for the broader stability of Chaol's rule. Ronan arrived with considerable fanfare, a tall, broad wolf with a calculating expression that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the confidence Vesper had once displayed before her own scheme unraveled. He greeted Chaol with careful, formal respect, though Elena did not miss the subtle challenge simmering beneath his polite words. "I trust this gathering finds you well, my king," Ronan said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena, with an assessment that felt almost clinical in its coldness. "I regret that circumstances require us to address such a delicate matter, but I believe the stability of our territories depends on complete transparency regarding matters of succession and legitimacy. I share your commitment to transparency, Cale replied evenly, though Elena could sense the controlled tension beneath his composed exterior. I trust you will find the truth of this matter considerably different from whatever rumors have reached your territory. The gathering began formally, once all the alphas had settled into their designated seats, Cale presiding from the head of the hall, with Elena standing beside him, her spine straight, despite the nervous energy coiling tightly within her chest. Ronan rose first, addressing the assembled leadership with practiced eloquence. Esteemed alphas, he began, we gather today to address concerns that have reached my territory, regarding the legitimacy of the king's chosen Luna. I do not raise these questions lightly, nor do I wish to cause offense to our king, or to the woman he has chosen. But the stability of our combined territories depends on absolute confidence in matters of succession and prophecy. Rumors have reached me suggesting that the mark claimed as proof of Elena's destined role may not be as genuine as initially presented, that circumstances surrounding her elevation to this position warrant closer scrutiny than has thus far been offered. Murmurs rippled through the assembled alphas, several exchanging uncertain glances as they considered the weight of such an accusation. Elena felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm, remembering Cale's steady confidence, the strength she had already proven capable of during far more difficult circumstances than this formal gathering. Cale rose to respond, his presence commanding immediate attention across the hall. Alpha Ronan raises serious accusations, he said, though I notice he offers no concrete evidence, beyond vague rumors, whose origin remains conveniently unexamined. I would ask him directly, before this assembly, to name the source of these claims, if he believes them credible enough to threaten the stability he claims to value so highly. A flicker of discomfort crossed Ronan's face, quickly masked behind his earlier composure. My sources wish to remain anonymous, given the sensitivity of the matter, he said carefully. Convenient, Cale replied, his tone carrying just enough edge to draw quiet laughter from several alphas seated closer to the front. I, however, have no such reluctance to name my sources. I have gathered evidence, formally documented and witnessed, confirming that these rumors originated not from any genuine concern regarding legitimacy, but from a deliberate scheme, orchestrated by someone seeking petty revenge against Elena, following her own failed attempt to have Elena falsely punished for a crime she did not commit. He gestured to Corwin, who stepped forward carrying formal documentation, including Dorian's sealed account of Vesper's confession, along with the traitor's testimony regarding the message delivered to Ronan's territory months earlier. The documents were passed among the assembled alphas, murmurs of surprise and disapproval spreading steadily through the hall, as the details became clear. Ronan's expression darkened considerably, as he realized the strength of evidence arrayed against his carefully constructed challenge. I was not aware of the questionable origins of this information, he said stiffly, though his tone lacked genuine conviction. Had I known, had you known, I suspect you would have pursued this matter regardless, Cale interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge now. Given your own history of seeking opportunities to challenge my authority, whenever circumstances present themselves. This gathering has cost considerable time and resources for every alpha present, based on rumors you yourself admit originated from a source with clear motive to deceive. The hall fell silent, tension thick in the air, as the assembled leadership absorbed the full weight of what had been revealed. Alpha Meredith of the Thornbrook territory, an older wolf known for her sharp intellect and fairness, finally broke the silence. I believe, she said slowly, that we have heard sufficient evidence to dismiss these particular concerns regarding legitimacy. However, I would like to hear directly from Elena herself, if she is willing to speak. Given the gravity of what has been questioned here today, I believe her own voice deserves to be heard clearly before this assembly reaches any final judgment. Cale glanced at Elena, offering silent support through his steady gaze, leaving the choice entirely to her whether she wished to speak. Elena took a steadying breath, drawing on the same courage that had carried her through 2 cold nights chained at Ashfall's gate, through the public revelation of her connection to Cale, through months of proving herself worthy within an unfamiliar court. She stepped forward, addressing the assembled alphas directly, her voice steady, despite the weight of so many skeptical eyes upon her. I did not seek this position, she began. I was an unranked Omega, orphaned young, surviving alone, at the edge of my former pack's territory, with no family, no connections, and no expectation that my life would ever change beyond quiet, isolated survival. When I was falsely accused of theft and chained at my pack's gate as punishment, I expected no rescue, no intervention, certainly no revelation, that I carried a prophetic mark connecting me to the Alpha King himself. She paused, meeting the eyes of several alphas directly before continuing. I understand the concern that legitimacy in matters of succession and prophecy must be carefully protected. I share that concern myself, which is precisely why I have spent every day since arriving in Kale's territory working to prove myself worthy of this position through my actions, not simply relying on the mark I carry as sufficient justification alone. I have studied governance, listened carefully to the concerns of ordinary pack members who might otherwise go unheard, and worked to earn the respect of this court through genuine effort rather than inherited privilege. Her voice grew steadier as she continued, old fear giving way to genuine conviction. The scheme against me, orchestrated by someone whose jealousy could not accept my survival without her approval, nearly succeeded in convincing this assembly to doubt something true and real, simply because it began in circumstances considered unworthy by those focused solely on rank and lineage. I would ask this assembly to consider not simply where I came from, but who I have proven myself to be since arriving here, and to judge me by that evidence rather than by rumors deliberately planted to serve someone else's petty revenge. Silence followed her words for a long moment before Alpha Meredith began to applaud slowly, followed gradually by several other alphas around the hall, the sound building into genuine, respectful acknowledgement of the courage and conviction Elena had displayed. Even several of the more skeptical leaders present found themselves nodding in reluctant approval, the weight of Elena's testimony clearly shifting the tenor of the gathering considerably. Ronan, recognizing the evident shift in sentiment against his challenge, offered a stiff, formal apology before retreating from the hall shortly after the gathering concluded, his earlier confidence thoroughly deflated by the strength of both the evidence and Elena's own testimony against his carefully constructed doubts. As the assembled alphas began departing over the following days, several approached Elena directly, offering genuine words of respect and encouragement that stood in stark contrast to their earlier skepticism. Alpha Meredith, in particular, spent considerable time speaking with Elena before her own departure, offering practical advice on governance and expressing genuine admiration for the strength Elena had displayed throughout the difficult proceedings. "You handled that remarkably well," Kale said, once the last of the visiting alphas had finally departed, leaving the great hall quiet once more after days of tense proceedings. "I am proud of you, Elena, more than I can properly express." Elena allowed herself to finally exhale fully, the accumulated tension of the gathering slowly releasing from her shoulders. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I kept thinking of everything I had already survived, and it seemed foolish to let fear win now, after everything that brought me to this point." Kale pulled her close, his relief evident in the tenderness of his embrace. "Whatever challenges Vesper or anyone else attempts to bring against us in the future, I believe now, more than ever, that we will face them successfully, together." Elena rested against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence, though she could not fully shake a lingering unease. Vesper's scheme had failed, publicly and decisively, but something told Elena that the woman's resentment ran too deep to simply accept defeat quietly, that whatever consequences now awaited her back in Ashfall might drive her toward even more desperate measures before this conflict finally, truly reached its end. News of the gathering's outcome reached Ashfall within days, carried swiftly by travelers eager to share such significant developments. Vesper received the news with a cold, sinking dread, understanding immediately that her carefully constructed scheme had not only failed, but had been thoroughly exposed before the collected leadership of every territory under Kale's rule. Dorian summoned her to his study that same evening, his expression carrying none of the uncertainty he had shown during her earlier confrontation with Kale. Months of humbled leadership had hardened him in certain ways, forced him to reckon more seriously with the consequences of allowing cruelty to flourish, unchecked within his pack. "Your scheme has caused considerable damage," Dorian said, his voice carrying a weary authority. "Not only to Elena, who has already suffered enough at your hands, but to the standing of this entire pack among our neighboring territories. The king has sent formal word regarding how he wishes this matter resolved. Vesper straightened, despite the fear evident in her eyes. What has he decided? You are to be banished from Ashfall territory, Dorian said simply, effective immediately. You will be permitted to gather only essential belongings, and you will not be welcome to return, nor will any other pack under the king's protection be permitted to accept you as a member, given the severity and persistence of your actions against an innocent woman. The color drained from Vesper's face as the full weight of the punishment settled over her. Banishment meant more than simple exile from Ashfall. It meant existing as a rogue wolf, without pack protection, without the safety and community that had defined her entire life until this moment. Father, she said, her voice cracking slightly. Surely there is some other way. There is not, Garrick said quietly from where he stood near the window, his own expression carrying a complicated mixture of grief and resignation. I have already pleaded on your behalf, more than you likely deserve, given everything you have done. The king's judgment stands, and I will not risk further consequences for this pack by continuing to argue against it. Vesper left Ashfall 3 days later, her belongings packed into a single modest bag, watched by pack members who offered neither sympathy nor open hostility, simply quiet acknowledgement that consequences, however severe, had finally caught up with actions that could no longer be excused or hidden. She did not look back as she passed through the same gate where Elena had once been chained, the irony of her own departure through that exact location, lost on no one who witnessed it. Word of Vesper's banishment eventually reached Elena, delivered by Cale during a quiet evening in their private quarters, his expression carefully neutral as he shared the news, watching for her reaction. I expected to feel satisfaction, Elena admitted slowly, considering her own complicated response to the news. Instead, I mostly feel sadness. Whatever twisted resentment drove her actions, I do not think banishment will heal whatever wound within her created such deep jealousy in the first place. Perhaps not, Cale agreed, but her actions caused genuine harm, repeatedly, even after facing consequences that should have taught restraint. Sometimes justice requires removing the source of continued danger, regardless of whether it addresses the deeper wounds that created it. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the necessity even as compassion continued to temper her sense of vindication. She thought of her own difficult path, the isolation and grief that had shaped her early years, and wondered whether circumstances might have driven her towards similar bitterness, had she not found, eventually, genuine connection and belonging within Cale's territory. It was a sobering thought, one that left her grateful for the path her own life had taken, even through such painful beginnings. With Vesper's threat finally fully resolved, and Ronan's challenge thoroughly discredited before the assembled leadership of every territory under Cale's protection, Elena found herself, for the first time since arriving in Cale's court, genuinely free from the shadows of her difficult past. The road ahead, she realized, finally lay open before her, unburdened by lingering threats or unresolved conflicts, ready for whatever future she and Cale might choose to build together. With the threats from Ronan and Vesper finally resolved, Cale called a private council meeting several weeks later, gathering his closest advisors, including Lady Iris and Fen, to discuss a matter he had been considering carefully since the gathering of alphas had concluded so decisively in Elena's favor. I intend to formally name Elena as Luna, Cale announced, not simply through prophecy or private declaration, but through proper coronation, witnessed by this court, and by representatives from every territory under our protection. I believe the time has come to solidify her position, beyond any future question or challenge. Lady Iris, who had grown to genuinely respect Elena over the preceding months, nodded approvingly. I believe the court is more than ready for such a ceremony. Elena has proven herself thoroughly, both through her handling of Ronan's challenge and through her steady, thoughtful contributions to governance since her arrival. Fen agreed readily as well, and the council quickly moved into planning the details of such a significant ceremony, one that would formally recognize Elena's position not simply as the king's chosen mate, but as full Luna, carrying equal authority and responsibility within the territory's governance. Cale found Elena later that evening, in their now familiar spot within the Packhouse Gardens, and shared the council's plans with a mixture of excitement and lingering nervousness that Elena found endearing, given how composed he typically remained in matters of governance. A formal coronation, Elena repeated, absorbing the weight of what he was proposing. That feels considerably more significant than everything that has happened thus far. It is significant, Cale agreed. But I believe it necessary, both to solidify your position beyond future challenge, and because I wish to formally honor everything you have already proven yourself to be within this court and beyond it. You are no longer simply the woman I found chained at Ashfall's gate, Elena. You have become someone this entire court, and increasingly the wider territories under my protection, genuinely respects and values. Elena felt a complicated swirl of emotions at his words, pride mixing with lingering disbelief that her life had transformed so completely from the isolated, overlooked existence she had known before. I would be honored, she said finally, to formally accept this role, alongside you. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of preparation, the entire packhouse buzzing with activity, as arrangements were made for what would become one of the most significant ceremonies the territory had witnessed in decades. Elena found herself swept into countless discussions regarding tradition and protocol, learning the deeper history behind ceremonies she had previously only heard about in passing stories. Ren, her healer friend, helped her prepare in more personal ways, sharing traditional herbal treatments meant to calm nerves and promote clarity ahead of significant occasions, while also simply providing steady companionship during a period that, despite its joy, carried considerable pressure and expectation. You seem nervous, Ren observed one afternoon as they sat together in the gardens, Elena absently plucking petals from a flower, while her mind wandered through the countless details still requiring attention before the ceremony. I am, Elena admitted. Not about Cale, or about wanting this role, but about doing it justice, about proving worthy of everything this ceremony represents, not just to the court, but to every ordinary wolf across these territories, who might look to me as an example of what fairness and genuine care can accomplish, regardless of where someone begins their life. Ren considered her words thoughtfully. I think that pressure you feel, that determination to prove worthy, is precisely why you already are worthy. Those who assume their position without such reflection rarely serve as thoughtfully as those who continually question whether they are doing enough. Elena appreciated the insight, tucking it away alongside the growing collection of wisdom she had gathered from various friends and advisors throughout her months within Cale's court. She thought often, during these weeks of preparation, of her mother's final words, of the strength her mother had insisted she carried, even when the world seemed determined to overlook her. Those words felt more true now than ever, validated through everything she had endured and overcome to arrive at this moment. As the ceremony approached, Cale surprised her one evening with an additional announcement, one that carried even more personal significance than the formal coronation itself. He led her to the same balcony where he had first confessed his genuine love for her months before, and this time, he knelt before her, producing a small, carefully crafted ring from within his cloak. Elena, he said, his voice carrying the same vulnerability she had witnessed during his earlier confession. I have loved you since long before I understood the depth of what connected us. I wish to bind myself to you not simply through ancient prophecy, and not simply through formal coronation as Luna, but through my own choice, freely given, to spend the rest of my life building a future alongside you. Will you marry me? Tears filled Elena's eyes as she looked down at him, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion carried in his simple, heartfelt question. Yes, she said, her voice thick with joy. Yes, of course, yes. Cale rose, slipping the ring gently onto her finger, before pulling her into an embrace that carried all the tenderness and relief of two people who had found, against considerable odds, exactly what they needed in each other. They remained there for a long while, wrapped in quiet happiness beneath the same stars that had once witnessed Elena's darkest, most desperate hours, now bearing witness instead to a joy she had never quite believed herself capable of experiencing so fully. News of their engagement spread quickly through the court and beyond, adding an additional layer of celebration to the already significant preparations for Elena's coronation as Luna. The combined ceremony, coronation and formal betrothal announced together, grew into an event of considerable scale, drawing interest and well wishes from territories across the northern lands, including, somewhat surprisingly, formal congratulations from several alphas who had witnessed her testimony during Ronan's failed challenge months before. Even Alpha Meredith sent word that she intended to attend personally, along with several other leaders who had come to respect Elena's character and capability during the earlier gathering. Their continued support meant more to Elena than she could easily express, a tangible sign that the doubts and skepticism she had once faced had genuinely transformed into respect earned through her own actions and character. As the day of the coronation finally arrived, Elena stood in her private quarters, dressed in ceremonial attire that felt almost unrecognizable compared to the simple, worn clothing she had known throughout most of her life. The dress, crafted specifically for the occasion, carried subtle embroidery depicting a crescent moon, a quiet nod to the mark that had first revealed her connection to Kale, transformed now from a source of confusion and uncertainty into a symbol of the strength and legitimacy she had proven through months of dedicated service and genuine care for the territories she would soon formally help govern. Ren helped her with the final preparations, carefully arranging her hair while offering quiet, reassuring words meant to calm the nervous energy Elena could not quite fully suppress despite everything. "You look radiant," Ren said, stepping back to admire the finished result. "Kale will not know what to do with himself when he sees you." Elena laughed softly, some of her nervousness easing at her friend's genuine warmth. "I hope you're right, though I suspect he will manage to compose himself well enough, given how much practice he's had maintaining composure before large gatherings." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Elena turned to find Lady Iris standing in the doorway, her expression carrying a warmth that would have seemed impossible during their first tense conversation in the library so many months before. "Are you ready?" Elena took a steadying breath, glancing once more at her reflection, at the woman she had become through everything she had endured and overcome since that first cold night chained at Ashfall's gate. "I believe I am," she said finally, and meant it fully. She made her way through the packhouse corridors, Iris and Ren accompanying her, until they reached the entrance to the Great Hall. Now transformed for the ceremony with elaborate decorations, gathered representatives from every territory under Kale's protection, filling the space with quiet anticipation. Through the open doorway, Elena caught sight of Kale waiting at the front of the hall, dressed in formal attire that emphasized the commanding presence she had first encountered as a mysterious black wolf watching her through Ashfall's gate, though now his expression carried none of the careful restraint from those early encounters, only open, unguarded joy at the sight of her approaching. As Elena began her walk down the length of the Great Hall, every eye in the gathering turning toward her, she felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her preparations in the preceding weeks. Instead, she felt only a steady, growing certainty, a sense that everything in her difficult, often lonely life had somehow led her precisely to this moment, to this hall, to this king who had seen worth in her when the world around her had seen only convenient blame. She thought briefly of Ashfall, of the chains that had once bound her wrists, of the cold nights spent wondering if anyone would ever come to her aid. She thought of her parents, gone too soon but present still in the strength they had instilled within her, in her mother's final words that had guided her through every difficult moment since. And she thought of the long, uncertain journey that had brought her from that isolated cabin at the edge of Ashfall's territory to this moment, standing before an entire gathered court, about to be formally recognized as Luna, of lands stretching far beyond anything she could have once imagined for herself. As she reached the front of the hall, Kale took her hands in his silver eyes carrying the same warmth and recognition she remembered from their very first conversation at the gate, though now free from any lingering uncertainty about what that recognition truly meant. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the future, Elena felt ready to face them, secure in the knowledge that she had already overcome far more than most, and had found, against considerable odds, a love and belonging she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Lady Iris stepped forward to preside over the formal proceedings, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall as she addressed the gathered representatives from every territory under Kale's protection. "We gather today to witness a moment of considerable significance," she began, "the formal coronation of Elena as Luna, of these territories, a role she has proven herself worthy of, not through inherited privilege, but through demonstrated character, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to justice and fairness." She turned to Elena directly, her expression carrying genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to her earlier skepticism. "Elena, do you accept the responsibilities of Luna, to serve these territories with fairness, to advocate for those without power or voice, and to stand as equal partner in governance alongside your king?" "I do," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the attentive hall. "And do you, King Cale," Iris continued, turning to address him, "formally recognize Elena as your Luna, granting her full authority and responsibility within these territories? And do you commit to honoring her voice and judgment as equal to your own in matters of governance?" "I do," Cale said, his gaze never leaving Elena's face, "with complete certainty and profound gratitude for everything she has already brought to this court, and to my own life." Iris lifted a delicate circlet, crafted from silver and set with a small, pale stone that caught the light of the hall's many candles, and placed it carefully upon Elena's head, the weight of it settling with surprising gentleness, despite the enormous significance it represented. "By the authority granted to me by this court, and witnessed by representatives of every territory under our king's protection, I formally recognize Elena as Luna of these lands." The hall erupted into applause, warm and genuine, filling the space with a celebration that felt worlds away from the cold, silent courtyard, where Elena had once knelt chained and humiliated. She glanced across the gathered crowd, catching sight of familiar faces, Ren beaming with pride, Fen offering an approving nod, even Corwin allowing himself a rare, genuine smile at the proceedings. Coral leaned close, his voice soft enough that only she could hear amid the celebration surrounding them. "How does it feel," he asked, "to finally stand here, recognized fully for everything you have always been?" Elena considered the question carefully, searching within herself for words adequate to the moment. "It feels," she said finally, "like coming home to a place I never knew existed, but somehow always belonged." The celebration continued long into the evening, the great hall filled with music and laughter, as representatives from across the northern territories mingled freely, offering their congratulations and well wishes to the newly crowned Luna and her betrothed king. Elena moved through the gathering with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those early, uncertain weeks following her arrival, greeting dignitaries and ordinary pack members alike, with the same genuine warmth that had gradually won over even her most skeptical critics. Alpha Meredith found her during a quieter moment near the edge of the hall, offering warm congratulations along with a knowing smile. "I suspected, during that difficult gathering months ago, that you would prove yourself remarkably capable," she said. "I am pleased to see my instincts were correct." "Your support meant a great deal to me," Elena said sincerely, "both then and now." "You earned it," Meredith replied simply. "Never forget that, Elena. Regardless of whatever challenges the future may still bring, you have already proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that you belong exactly where you now stand." As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, Cale found Elena once more near the balcony overlooking the valley, the same spot where he had first confessed his love and later proposed marriage, now bearing witness to the culmination of everything that journey had built toward. The stars overhead shone with the same quiet brilliance as they had that very first night at Ashfall's gate, though the woman standing beneath them now bore little resemblance to the frightened, chained figure from those distant, difficult memories. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, leaning into Cale's steady presence beside her, "for seeing something worth fighting for, that night at the gate, when everyone else saw only convenient blame." Cale pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arms wrapping securely around her as they gazed out over the peaceful valley below, their future stretching ahead of them full of promise and possibility. "Thank you," he replied softly, "for proving, every single day since, that my instincts that night were correct beyond anything I could have possibly imagined." They remained there together for a long while, wrapped in comfortable silence beneath the stars, two souls who had found, against considerable odds, exactly what they had each been searching for without fully realizing it, a partnership built not simply on ancient prophecy, but on genuine respect, hard-earned trust, and a love that had grown steadily stronger through every challenge they had faced together. Nearly a year after her coronation, Elena stood once more before the iron gates of Ashfall, though this time she arrived not as a chained prisoner, but as Luna, traveling alongside Cale on a formal visit meant to strengthen the bonds between his territory and the pack where her extraordinary journey had first begun. The gate looked smaller than she remembered, less imposing now that she approached it with confidence and purpose, rather than fear and confusion. Dorian greeted them personally at the entrance, his demeanor considerably humbled compared to the stern authority he had once wielded so carelessly. The months since Elena's departure had clearly weighed on him, the responsibility of rebuilding trust within his own pack, along with the ongoing scrutiny of Cale's continued oversight, having tempered whatever arrogance had once allowed injustice to flourish so easily under his leadership. Luna Elena, Dorian said, bowing formally, the title carrying none of the awkwardness it might have held during her earliest days adjusting to her new position. Ashfall is honored by your visit. Thank you, Alpha Dorian, Elena replied, her voice carrying the same steady confidence she had cultivated throughout her time in Cale's court. I have been looking forward to seeing how the pack has fared since my departure. As they walked through the familiar courtyard, Elena noticed subtle but meaningful changes throughout Ashfall. The atmosphere felt different somehow, less rigid and fearful than she remembered. Pack members, going about their business with a visible ease that suggested Dorian's leadership had genuinely shifted toward greater fairness and accountability since Cale's initial intervention. Old Marta approached eagerly once she caught sight of Elena, her weathered face breaking into a proud, delighted smile. I told you, the universe recognizes things before we do, she said, pulling Elena into a warm embrace that carried none of the formal distance typically expected between a Luna and an ordinary pack healer. Look at you now, exactly as I always suspected you would become. Elena laughed, genuine warmth spreading through her chest, at the reunion, with someone who had shown her kindness during the darkest days of her ordeal. I owe you more gratitude than I properly expressed at the time, she said. Your care meant everything during those difficult days. You owe me nothing, Marta said firmly. Simply continue doing what you've clearly already been doing, using your position to ensure others never suffer the way you once did. That will be gratitude enough. Elena spent the following days touring the territory, meeting with pack members both formally and informally, listening carefully to concerns and observations that Dorian's leadership, still adjusting to genuine accountability, might have otherwise overlooked. She found herself particularly drawn to conversations with the pack's younger members, Omegas, and unranked wolves, who reminded her keenly of her own earlier isolation, offering them genuine encouragement and practical guidance on how to advocate for themselves within a system that had once so thoroughly failed her. Petran, the young guard whose courageous testimony had first helped uncover the truth behind Vesper's scheme, approached her during one such gathering, his earlier nervousness replaced by evident confidence and growing respect within the pack. Your visit means a great deal to those of us who remember how things once were here, he said. Alpha Dorian has worked hard to change, but seeing you return, seeing proof that justice truly can prevail, matters more than words can properly express. Change takes time, Elena said thoughtfully, and requires constant vigilance to ensure it takes root properly, rather than fading once immediate consequences pass. I am glad to see Ashfall genuinely working toward that change, rather than simply performing compliance while I remained watching. As her visit drew toward its conclusion, Elena found herself standing alone, one final evening, at the very gate where her extraordinary journey had first begun, Cale having given her space to process the moment privately, before their scheduled departure the following morning. She traced her fingers along the cold iron, remembering vividly the chains that had once bound her wrists, the desperate cold of those 2 long nights, the fear and humiliation that had once defined this exact location within her memory. Now, standing here as Luna, secure in her position, surrounded by genuine love and respect, earned through months of dedicated effort, that painful memory felt transformed, no longer a wound that defined her, but rather a foundation upon which everything else had been built. The suffering she had endured here had ultimately led her to discover strength she had not known she possessed, to find love and belonging she had never dared to imagine, and to develop a genuine capacity for justice and compassion that now benefited territories far beyond this single, formerly isolated pack. Cale found her there as darkness began settling over the valley, joining her quietly at the gate, without disturbing her contemplation. How does it feel? He asked softly, returning here now, after everything that has changed. Elena considered the question carefully, drawing on the same thoughtful reflection that had become second nature throughout her time as Luna. It feels like closure, she said finally. Not because the pain of what happened here has disappeared entirely, but because I have finally made peace with it, transformed it into something that serves a genuine purpose rather than simply haunting me. You have done remarkable work, Chaol said, not just for Ashfall, but for every territory that has witnessed how thoroughly you have embraced your role as Luna. I am endlessly proud of everything you have accomplished. Elena leaned into him, drawing comfort from his steady presence, as she had grown accustomed to doing throughout their journey together. I could not have accomplished any of it without you, she said honestly. Without your willingness to see worth in someone the world had overlooked. Without your patience in allowing me to choose this path, rather than simply demanding I accept it. You would have found your way regardless, Chaol said gently. I simply had the fortune of being present when you finally received the opportunity to prove it. They stood together at the gate for a long while, watching the last light fade from the sky, the same stars that had once witnessed Elena's darkest hours, now shining down on a woman who had transformed unimaginable suffering into genuine purpose and belonging. Behind them, Ashfall continued its quiet evening routines, a pack slowly healing from the injustices of its past, guided now by leadership that had learned, however painfully, the true cost of allowing cruelty to flourish unchecked. During her final evening in Ashfall, Elena received unexpected news through Dorian, delivered with careful hesitation, regarding Vesper's fate since her banishment nearly a year before. A traveling merchant had brought word that Vesper had eventually found her way to a small settlement far to the south, well beyond the territories under Chaol's protection, where she now lived a quiet, considerably humbled existence among wolves who knew nothing of her past mistakes. She sent no message, no apology, Dorian clarified. Only word, reached through the merchant's casual mention of an Omega, matching her description, settling into ordinary work within that distant community. I thought you deserved to know, given everything that transpired between you. Elena considered the news thoughtfully, surprised by the complicated mixture of emotions it stirred within her. She felt no desire for further vengeance, no lingering need to see Vesper suffer additional consequences beyond what she had already faced. Instead, she felt something closer to quiet hope that perhaps, in this new setting, away from the position and privilege that had once fueled such destructive jealousy, Vesper might genuinely find a way to build a more honest, humble existence. Thank you for telling me, Elena said. I hope, wherever she has landed, that she finds some measure of genuine peace, even if she never fully reckons with everything her actions once cost me. That is more grace than I suspect I could offer, in your position, Dorian admitted quietly. Perhaps, Elena said, but holding on to anger toward her would only continue giving her power over my life, long after she lost any real ability to affect it. I would rather spend that energy building something meaningful instead. Dorian studied her for a long moment, something like genuine admiration flickering behind his composed expression. Ashfall is fortunate, he said, that the king recognized your worth when this pack so thoroughly failed to. I hope, in whatever small way remains possible, that our continued efforts toward fairness might eventually earn back some measure of the trust we so carelessly squandered. Actions consistently repeated over time earn trust far more reliably than words ever could, Elena said gently. Continue the path you have begun, Alpha Dorian, and I believe that trust will follow naturally. The following morning, as Elena and Chaol prepared to depart, a small crowd gathered near the gate to bid them farewell, considerably different from the silent, indifferent crowd that had once watched Elena suffer without a single voice raised in her defense. Pack members called genuine well-wishes, several expressing hope that Elena might return again soon, that her visits might continue offering guidance and inspiration to a community still working to rebuild genuine trust and fairness within its own structure. As they rode away from Ashfall's territory, the iron gate gradually disappearing behind them into the morning mist, Elena felt a profound sense of completion settle over her, the final chapter of her difficult past finally closing, to make way for whatever future still awaited her and Chaol together. She thought of her mother's final words, of the strength her mother had insisted she carried, even during the darkest, most uncertain moments of her life. She understood now, more fully than she ever had before, exactly what those words had meant. The strength her mother spoke of had never been about avoiding suffering or hardship entirely. It had been about carrying dignity and hope through whatever difficulties life presented, about refusing to let cruelty or injustice define her fundamental worth, and about remaining open to unexpected connection and love, even after enduring circumstances that might have hardened a lesser spirit entirely. Elena glanced over at Cale, riding steadily beside her, his expression carrying the same quiet confidence and genuine warmth she had come to treasure throughout their journey together. Whatever challenges the future still held, she felt ready to face them, secure in the knowledge that she had already transformed unimaginable adversity into genuine strength, and that the love she had found, against every reasonable expectation, remained as steady and true as the mountains surrounding the valley she now called home. The story of the woman once chained at Ashfall's gate as punishment had transformed, over the course of a single remarkable year, into the story of a Luna whose wisdom, compassion, and hard-earned strength now guided territories far beyond anything she could have once imagined for herself. And as she and Cale continued their journey homeward together, Elena carried with her not just the title and authority of her new position, but the profound, unshakable knowledge that even the darkest beginnings can lead toward light, that even the most overlooked among us can discover, against every expectation, exactly where they truly belong.